Welcome back to Mr. Belcho. Whether you're watching from your room, your car, or deep in the woods, thank you for being here. What time is it where you are right now? Because what we're about to share, it changes everything you know about park rangers. They're the ones we trust with our safety, alone in the wilderness for hours, days, nights, dealing with lost hikers, wildlife encounters, equipment failures. But what happens when they discover something that shouldn't exist in those forests? Something that doesn't follow the rules of nature? Park rangers witness things the public never sees, and sometimes they pay the price. Tonight on Mr. Belcho, one ranger's struggle against the wilderness becomes a nightmare he can't escape. If this unsettles you, like this video, subscribe to Mr. Belcho, help expose what they've been hiding. Lock your doors, get comfortable. Because what this ranger encountered, it started with a simple patrol.
I've been a ranger in the Appalachian wilderness for 17 years, and I've learned that fear has a smell. It's different for everyone. For some it's copper, for others it's the sharp chemical bite of adrenaline. For me it smells like wet earth mixed with something organic that I can never quite identify. That smell hit me on a Tuesday in October, 3 miles into the backcountry of the Southern Range, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. My name is Dakota Winters. Yes, my mother named me after her grandfather, a man she claimed came from Cherokee lineage, though the family story had been diluted by generations and relocations. I've never made it into a defining part of my identity. I'm just a man who knows forests better than he knows people, and that knowledge has kept me alive more times than I can count. That morning, before the smell came, I'd noticed the deer. The North Fork Trail had been quiet, which wasn't unusual for October. Hunting season had scattered most wildlife deeper into the protected zones, but it wasn't total silence. You never get total silence in an old forest. There were always birds, the movement of small creatures, the subtle displacement of air that tells you the wilderness is breathing. But as I walked the marked path, checking for erosion and fallen trees, I saw the deer first. It was a doe, standing broadside to the trail about 50 yards ahead of me. This wasn't alarming on its own. I encountered deer regularly, but this one wasn't moving, not in the way deer move. She stood absolutely still, her body rigid, her head turned at an angle that seemed wrong. The angle was too much, too twisted, her black eye fixed on something beyond my line of sight. I kept moving, slow, professional. Then I saw the second deer, and the third, all within a quarter-mile stretch of the trail, all positioned at different intervals along the path, all standing in that same unnatural rigidity, all angled in slightly different directions, but all watching something, or perhaps being positioned to watch something. This was the first real warning, though I didn't acknowledge it then. A ranger learns to notice patterns, but he also learns that patterns can be coincidence, and paranoia gets you reassigned to desk work. By noon, I'd logged 8 dead deer spread across the entire northern sector of my patrol area. Not killed recently, that was the strange part. They weren't fresh. The decomposition was advanced but not complete, meaning they'd been dead for days. The bodies were positioned with an odd deliberation, though animals could have been responsible. Scavengers rearrange carcasses, weather shifts them, but the alignment still bothered me. The smell came around 2 p.m. I was checking a series of stone markers near the ridge line when it hit that wet earth mixed with something rotten and deeply wrong. Not like dead animals usually smell. Richer, older. Like something had been decaying since before the summer. I've smelled death in the forest plenty of times. This was different. I pulled my field radio to call it in, then stopped. Call in what? A bad smell? A pattern of dead animals that could have natural explanations? The regional office in Charleston had already suggested my patrol routes were overcautious. 2 months earlier, I'd called in a potentially dangerous trail condition that turned out to be a misidentified fallen branch. The chief ranger had made his disappointment very clear, so I didn't call it in. Instead, I marked the location on my map and continued my patrol route. Professional, routine, just a ranger doing his job. I didn't see him until late afternoon. The figure was on the opposite ridge, visible through the thinning tree line. Fall was stripping the forest bare. Another month and the leaves would be gone completely. He was tall, impossibly tall, standing motionless on the ridgeline silhouetted against the graying sky. He wore dark clothing, or perhaps it was just the distance and angle that made it appear dark. Even from that distance, I could sense something off about his posture, his proportions. I watched him for maybe 30 seconds. He was watching back, or at least facing my direction. No actual eye contact was possible at that range, but I felt it. I felt the weight of his attention. Then he was gone, not walking away, just gone. I might have assumed he'd stepped behind the trees, except the descent from that ridge would have taken him through a visible clearing. In the 2 or 3 seconds I looked away to check my footing on the rocky ground, he vanished. I told myself he'd moved behind the tree line. It was the logical explanation. But my hands were shaking when I checked my watch and realized I had maybe 90 minutes of good daylight left. The trail back to base camp should have taken an hour. It took me 2 hours and 40 minutes. I didn't run. Rangers don't run, it sends the wrong message to the wilderness. But I moved with purpose. Efficient, direct. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder or check the ridgelines above me. The forest was changing as the sun sank lower. The spaces between trees grew darker. Sounds became harder to place. A snapping branch could have been a deer or a falling tree or something deliberate. Twice, I heard footsteps that weren't mine. The first time was around a mile from camp. Distinct footsteps, heavy, matching my pace exactly when I walked and stopping when I stopped. I turned, knife drawn, just the standard ranger issue, 8 inches, nothing tactical, and found empty forest. The footsteps resumed from a different direction. The second time it was closer. Close enough that I could hear the breath, heavy and wrong somehow, a sound that seemed to come from too high up, from a throat that wasn't calibrated for human respiration. I ran then. I abandoned the protocol about not running and I covered the last half-mile to camp in a sprint that left my lungs burning. I reached the ranger station at 6:47 p.m., according to the log. The sun was already dropping below the western ridge. I filed a report about wildlife disturbances and completed my daily forms with hands that were still shaking. I told myself it was just adrenaline, just the forest playing tricks, just the onset of seasonal darkness making a seasoned ranger lose his composure. It happened to everyone. Even 17-year veterans, but I checked the door locks 3 times that night, and I kept my knife on the pillow next to my bed. The next morning, I almost convinced myself that everything had been a misinterpretation. The dead deer were still real, I could verify that. The pattern was still there, but patterns could mean anything. Illness could have struck a herd, predation could account for the positioning, and the figure on the ridge, a hiker, a poacher, a fellow ranger from the adjacent sector, though the timing and distance made that unlikely. The rational mind is a powerful thing. It can talk you down from legitimate fear, repackage it as fatigue and stress. I'd been working too hard. I needed a day off. I needed to get into town, have a beer, remember what human civilization felt like. I took a personal day. Charleston was a 40-minute drive, and the drive alone helped. Highways, traffic, people. The forest was reduced to distant green in the rearview mirror. I had lunch at a diner near the university, read a newspaper that was 3 days old, and convinced myself that the fear from yesterday was already fading. It came back the moment I turned onto the road toward the ranger station. Not fear, not exactly, more like a pressure, a sense of something waiting. I told myself it was psychological, my brain creating expectations based on a single unusual day. But the pressure didn't ease as I drove deeper into the backcountry. The ranger station sits on the western edge of the protected zone, about 2 miles from the main forest access points. When I pulled into the small gravel lot, I noticed my truck was the only vehicle there. Randy, the evening ranger, wasn't due until 6. I had the station to myself for at least 4 hours. I spent those hours checking inventory, filing reports, doing routine maintenance tasks, all work that needed doing anyway. But every time I sat down, I found myself standing up again within minutes. My focus was scattered. The coffee I made tasted like copper. At 5:30, I decided to drive to the northern access point where the trail system began. I told myself I was checking for vehicle break-ins, something I did about once a week. It was a legitimate job task. It had nothing to do with the fact that the northern access was near where I'd seen the figure yesterday. The access point parking area was empty. 5 spaces, all vacant. The late afternoon light was taking on that golden quality it gets in October, the kind of light that makes the world look like it exists in a photograph, beautiful and distant. I parked and walked the equipment trail, the one that runs parallel to the public path but hidden behind the marker fence. Rangers use it for maintenance access. It gives you a view of the main trail without being visible to hikers. The view today showed me something that made my stomach tighten. The main trail had been disturbed. Not by hikers, the disturbance was too organized for that. Someone had deliberately torn back underbrush on both sides of the path for a stretch of about 30 yards. It was methodical, precise, like creating a corridor that gave clear sight lines from the forest to anyone walking the trail. And there were marks on the trail itself, not boot prints. I've seen plenty of those. These were different, deeper, spaced wider than any human stride I'd seen. And they weren't continuous. They appeared, then stopped, then appeared again in a slightly different direction, like something was testing different approaches. I photographed them with my phone. 7 images from different angles. My hands were steady when I took the photos. That's what I remember most clearly. The fear had turned into something else. Documentation mode. Ranger mode. Something that let me function. By the time Randy showed up at 6, I'd convinced myself I wasn't going to mention it. The marks could be explained. The cleared brush could be explained. I was a rational person. I would wait. I would observe. And if the pattern continued, if it escalated, then I would make my report. Randy was a younger ranger, maybe 26, and he had that enthusiasm that comes from people who still think the wilderness is mostly benign. He asked me about my day and I said it was quiet. He asked about the patrol and I said everything was normal. He ate a sandwich and reviewed his evening route before heading out around 7. And I didn't tell him to be careful. That's something I've regretted every day since. He was back within 2 hours. Not radioing in, he just came bursting through the station door, and I'd never seen real panic on a person's face until that moment. Panic looks a lot like something breaking. It looks like the fracture point where a person stops being functional and becomes pure fear. "There's something wrong," Randy said. His voice was fractured the same way his face was. "On the West Trail, about a mile in." "What kind of something?" I stood up immediately. "I don't know. I heard it, and I saw." He stopped. His hands were shaking worse than mine had been. "Did you see anything today? Anything unusual?" This was the moment where I should have told him about the marks, the disturbance, the figure on the ridge. This was the moment where protocol demanded I share information that could affect his safety. I didn't. "No," I lied. "What did you hear?" "Breathing," he said. "Really heavy, like something big was moving parallel to the trail, staying in the trees. When I turned toward the sound, it moved, deliberately moved away from me, but at exactly the same pace, like it was maintaining distance." Predator behavior, or the behavior of something that understood the nature of pursuit and preferred to avoid confrontation. "Large animal," I said, using my ranger voice. "Professional, calm, probably a black bear. Fall feeding season has them active. Did you make noise? Did you use your whistle?" "It wasn't a bear," Randy said. "I know bears. I've encountered bears. This," he stopped again. "This was something else." We both knew what he meant. We both knew he was talking about the thing that doesn't have an official designation, the thing that Park Services deny exists, the thing that shows up in ranger stations' anonymous forums and private message boards late at night, the thing people report and are subtly encouraged to reassess their account of what they experienced. "It was probably a bear," I said again. This time it sounded like I was convincing myself. "I'll do a patrol tomorrow. Look for tracks, scat, marks on trees. We'll figure out what's out there." Randy nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He also didn't argue about his shift. He handed me his equipment, made some excuse about feeling ill, and left within 20 minutes. I was alone in the ranger station at 9 p.m. on the second night. The walls seemed to press in more than they had before. The windows became reflective, showing me my own face floating in darkness outside. I made dinner. I read reports. I did everything normal. And at exactly 11 p.m. I heard something that made my blood stop moving. It was a sound like something heavy being dragged across the corrugated metal roof of the station. Not an animal. Animals don't move like that. They don't create that kind of deliberate, persistent, testing sound. This was something feeling the roof, testing its integrity, moving with what sounded like intelligence. I turned off the lights. Not tactical brilliance, just instinct. If something was on the roof, I didn't want it to know I was awake. I sat in the darkness of the ranger station, my knife in my hand, and I listened to whatever it was move back and forth above my head. It took 40 minutes to leave. The sound just stopped. One moment it was there, the next it wasn't. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like another kind of presence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the darkness with my knife and my fear, and I made a decision that would cost me more than I understood at the time. I wasn't going to let anyone else know how afraid I was. Not Randy, not the chief ranger, not anyone, because fear was contagious in the Forest Service. And if I admitted I was scared, if I admitted that something was wrong, the entire operation would shift. More rangers would be sent in. Hikers would be warned away. Questions would be asked, and I wanted to see what happened next. The problem with the wilderness is that it adapts faster than you do. You think you understand it after 17 years. You know where the dangerous ridges are. You know which streams have treacherous undercurrents. You know the seasonal patterns, the animal migrations, the way weather systems move through the valleys. You become confident in that knowledge. You start to believe you've mapped the territory, that it holds no more surprises. Then it changes. And you realize you were never mapping the territory at all. You were just cataloging your own ignorance in a way that felt like understanding. The changes started small. The third morning, I found marks on the equipment shed door. Not scratch marks. I would have expected those. These were deliberately created depressions in the old wood, spaced at intervals that suggested something tall moving its hands down the door surface. Testing, searching, checking what was inside. But here's what made it worse. I could place the height. Based on the spacing, the thing's hands had been approximately 7.5 feet above the ground. I photographed those too. I kept photographs now, on my phone, on my ranger's documentation tablet. A record of escalation, a record of something learning about me and my station, adapting its approach. By day 5, the deer were gone. All of them. I drove the full circuit of my patrol route, and the ones I'd found before had been removed. The bodies, the pattern, all of it, gone. It was like evidence being erased, like a message being delivered. I know what you see. I can make it disappear. Randy didn't come back. I heard he'd requested a transfer, and the paperwork had gone through in record time. Sometimes the Forest Service moves slowly. Sometimes it moves at the speed of someone who understands that loose rangers talk too much. I was working alone. The nights became the dangerous part. Daytime, I could convince myself I was being logical. I'd see footprints in the mud near my truck, prints that were too wide, too deep, with toes spread at angles no human foot could manage. But in daylight, with sun on my face and the sound of birds in the trees, I could tell myself they were distorted by erosion. The mind is suggestible in daylight. It can be convinced. At night, my mind had no defense. It came to the station twice more, once in the form of that dragging sound on the roof, another time as actual scratching at the window frame, deliberate and testing, like something checking if the glass would break under pressure. The scratching lasted 17 minutes by my watch. Each pass sounded angrier, more frustrated. I sat in absolute darkness those nights. I didn't breathe loudly. I didn't move. I existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the sound to stop, waiting for the pressure to lift. But the worst part wasn't the visits. The worst part was the things I found on the morning of day 8. I'd been keeping a routine even though I was the only ranger on station. I'd do my patrols, file my reports, maintain equipment. I was trying to hold on to the structure of normalcy. But that morning I found something on my patrol route that changed everything. It was the remains of a hiker, not fresh. This person had been dead for weeks, maybe months. But the position of the body, the way it had been arranged, was what struck me. The hiker, I found his ID later, a man named Joshua Chen from Pennsylvania, had been left in the middle of the trail, carefully positioned, almost as if he was being displayed. His backpack was beside him, unopened. His boots were placed beside the backpack, arranged in perfect parallel. The body itself was partially decomposed, which is expected after weeks of exposure. But the face, what remained of the face, was turned toward the trail, toward the direction a ranger on patrol would approach. Arranged to be found, arranged to be a message. I radioed it in immediately. This was beyond my ability to rationalize away. This was a body. This was a death. This required protocol. The investigation took 3 days. State police came in. Federal investigators were contacted because it was on protected land. They never figured out how Joshua Chen had died. The autopsy report, I read it later through an acquaintance in the Charleston office, indicated cause of death as inconclusive. There were no obvious trauma marks, no signs of predation, no indication of how a healthy 30-year-old man had ended up dead in the middle of my patrol route. Some of the investigators asked me if I'd noticed anything unusual. I told them about the dead deer. I told them about unusual animal activity. I didn't tell them about the figure on the ridge or the marks on the roof or the footprints that didn't belong to anything I could identify. I was protecting something. I can see that now. I was protecting the thing by not naming it, but it was protecting me too. That became clear when the investigators got one of the wrong answers. There was a junior investigator, a woman named Sarah Mackenzie, who was too good at her job. She'd been checking previous missing person reports in the region, and she'd found others. Hikers who'd gone missing and never been found. Reports filed. Investigations opened. Cases closed without resolution. The pattern went back 12 years. She was asking questions. She was connecting threads. She was getting close to something that should have stayed hidden. The night she was asking those questions, I heard the sound again, the dragging on the roof. But this time it extended beyond the station. I watched from the darkened window as it moved across the adjacent structure where the investigators had set up a temporary base. The sound was deliberate. It was a demonstration. By morning, Sarah Mackenzie had decided the case was unsolvable. Her supervisor agreed. The investigation was closed by noon. I drove her to the access point where she'd left her car. We didn't speak much, but as she was leaving, she looked at me with an expression that suggested she understood more than she was saying. "Be careful," she told me. "Whatever is out there, it's been doing this for a long time. It has a system, a pattern. Don't break that pattern." Then she was gone, and I was alone again, with 17 years of training and a complete understanding that my training meant nothing, that the forest I thought I knew was a false surface, that beneath it something ancient and patient was following its own logic, and I was beginning to understand what the pattern was. It was feeding, and it had chosen the time and place and method, and we, all of us, the rangers, the hikers, the investigators, were participating in a dance that had been choreographed long before any of us arrived. I've been thinking about the moment I became complicit. Was it when I didn't tell Randy what I'd found? Was it when I lied to the investigators? Or was it earlier, when I saw that thing on the ridge and felt the pressure of its attention and understood on some level I couldn't articulate that it was testing me? That it was deciding whether I belonged to the forest in the way it did? I think the real moment came on day 17. By then I'd stopped going into town. I'd stopped filing detailed reports. I'd fallen into a rhythm with the forest that terrified me but also, in a way I hate to admit, made sense. The thing, I still can't name it, some part of me refuses to name it, had stopped coming to the station. The dragging on the roof had stopped. The testing sounds had stopped, but I'd started hearing it differently. During my patrols, I'd catch sounds that matched my footsteps, not following, matching, like a mirror. When I'd turn, there would be nothing visible, but I could feel it. I could feel its presence like a pressure behind my eyes. It was following the rules now. It was staying just outside direct line of sight. It was teaching me its boundaries. That's when I found the second body. This one was fresh, maybe 12 hours dead. Another hiker. Another person who'd come to experience the natural beauty of the protected zone. This hiker I recognized, a woman who'd checked in at the ranger station 3 days earlier, asked for trail recommendations, seemed excited about her overnight backpacking trip. She was arranged like Joshua Chen had been, centered on the trail, her equipment placed with geometric precision, her face turned toward the direction I would approach from. But there was something different about this scene. I noticed it immediately. Her body was positioned so that if I walked the normal trail route, I would step almost directly on her. The path had been modified. Undergrowth had been deliberately cleared to make the body impossible to miss. This wasn't a display. This was a threshold, and I understood, standing there in the autumn forest with a dead woman at my feet, that I was being asked to make a choice. I could report it. I could involve the authorities again. I could send investigators back into the forest, trigger another investigation, another closure, more disruption, or I could walk around the body. I could mark its location differently in my patrol notes. I could adjust my report. I could keep the pattern intact. The thing in the forest had killed before. It had been killing for years. It would keep killing. But it had a system, and that system worked. It worked because people disappeared in the forest naturally. It worked because evidence decomposed. It worked because investigators eventually gave up. It worked because I helped it work. I called it in from the ranger station. I stayed professional. I answered questions. I cooperated fully. But I reported the body location as approximately a quarter mile from where I actually found it. I adjusted the timestamps on my patrol route. I made small changes that meant nothing except for one thing. They meant the actual location of the body would be harder to find, The exact positioning harder to document. The investigation lasted 4 days this time. The investigators were getting tired. The cases were the same. The wilderness had already taken its due. Sometimes nature wins. Sometimes people die in the forest, and there's no story, no closure, just the facts of how vulnerable humans are in places they don't belong. By the time the second body had been processed and the second case closed, I understood what was happening. The thing wasn't controlling me through fear anymore. Fear was just the initial mechanism. What it had actually done was use fear to put me in a position where I could make choices. I could help. I could participate. I could become part of the system that let it continue to exist and feed. And that was worse than fear, because now I had to live with the knowledge that I was making those choices. No one was forcing me. The thing had done something more effective than torture. It had shown me what cooperation would look like, and it had made that cooperation feel rational. I'm on day 28 now. The ranger station has requested my retirement paperwork be drawn up. They didn't ask me directly, just mentioned that a lot of rangers tend to burn out after a major incident, that there were no hard feelings if I wanted to step down. It's a graceful exit, a way for them to shuffle me out before the questions about my reports get too detailed. I'll probably take it. But before I do, I want to write this down. I want someone to understand what happens in these places. What happens when the wilderness decides to let something stay hidden. What happens when fear teaches you that cooperation is the path of least resistance? I haven't seen the thing in 5 days, but I'm not afraid anymore. I understand now what the footsteps were doing on that first night. They weren't hunting me. They were learning my pattern. They were understanding what would make me complicit. They were seeing what I would sacrifice to keep the peace. Because that's the real horror of the Appalachian wilderness. It's not the creatures. It's what we're willing to accept, what we're willing to ignore, what we're willing to become in order to survive in spaces that don't want us there. I walk the patrol route tomorrow for the last time. I haven't decided what I'll report when I find the next body. And that's the point where I should be terrified. That's the point where I should be running. Instead, I'm just tired. I'm just accepting the way the forest works. And I'm trying not to think about how much longer I'll be able to live with that. The thing on the ridge is still watching. I can feel it even now as I write this in the darkness of the ranger station. It's waiting to see what I do next. It's seeing if I understand the pattern. I think I do, and I think that understanding is what it wanted all along. I found the first body on a Wednesday morning in late October, and I've never been the same since. My name is Dakota Redhawk, and I've worked as a ranger in the Appalachian High Country for 11 years. 11 years of bear patrols, lost hikers, equipment checks, and mundane paperwork. I know these mountains better than I know my own reflection. I know where the turkey roost on Ridge 47, where the rhododendron thickets close in so tight you can't breathe, where the water gets cold enough in the deep hollows that hypothermia sets in within minutes. I know these mountains in ways that made me believe I was safe here. I was wrong. The call came through my radio at 6:47 a.m. A hiker had reported finding something on the bear trail near Meadow Gap, something that looked wrong. The dispatcher's voice was tight. She'd already sent the state police, but they wanted a ranger first. Park Service property, Park Service jurisdiction. My problem, I made the drive in 14 minutes, my truck eating up the winding mountain road with the kind of aggressive speed I haven't used since my early years. Something in the dispatcher's tone had triggered that old instinct, the one that tells you something is genuinely off. The hiker, a woman named Sarah Chen from Cincinnati, was waiting at the trailhead with her husband. They looked gray, actual gray, the color people get when their body is running on adrenaline and dread. "Show me," I said. The walk was 3.2 miles in. I know because I'd measured that trail 100 times. The hiking community likes to know exact distances. But that morning, with the autumn mist hanging low and the October cold biting through my ranger jacket, those 3.2 miles felt like something from a geometry nightmare, stretching, bending, refusing to resolve into anything normal. We found the body in a clearing off trail, about 50 yards from where the Chen said they'd been walking. It was a man, and I can tell you what I observed because I've learned to separate observation from emotion. It's a survival skill in this work. Male, approximately 35 to 50 years old, lying face down near a cluster of rhododendron. His right arm was extended, His left leg was bent at an angle that wasn't natural. His clothing, a blue fleece jacket, hiking boots, tan pants, was intact but covered in something that looked like mud and forest litter. But it was the state of him. The wrong state of him. His head was twisted too far toward his left shoulder. Not just twisted, turned, like something had begun to rotate it and then stopped, or had been interrupted. The skin on the back of his neck was dark, discolored, but not from decomposition. The timeline wasn't right for that. The Chen said they found him 15 minutes before calling 911. 15 minutes. I told them to wait at the clearing. I approached the body alone. The first thing I noticed was the eyes. He was lying face down, but his eyes were open, both of them. Eyes don't stay open like that unless they're held open or the head has been turned so violently that the muscles have locked. His eyes were looking sideways, looking back along his own spine, looking at an angle that human anatomy simply doesn't permit. His mouth was open. There was foam there, dried and crusted, or saliva. It was hard to tell in the dappled morning light. I radioed the state police, gave them my location, gave them the situation, told them to come prepared for a death investigation, possibly involving trauma. I kept my voice professional. I've been trained for this. I'd attended an evidence preservation seminar in 2019. I knew what to do. What I didn't know was that I was looking at a warning. The state police arrived 90 minutes later, along with paramedics and a detective named Grayson who had worked the mountains for 23 years. He was a competent man, methodical, the kind of investigator who notices things. We worked the scene together, documenting everything. The body was identified as Marcus Webb, a research biologist from Boone who'd been hiking alone, a habit according to his emergency contacts that he did every other weekend. What killed him? I asked Grayson, after the paramedics had begun the process of moving the body. That's the question, Grayson said. He had a thin face and darker eyes that seemed to look at more than what was directly in front of him. No obvious trauma, no wounds, no signs of predator activity, no poisoning indicators, no foam at the mouth like that from most poisons. But you never know. Coroner will tell us. Might be he had a heart attack, fell wrong, twisted his neck on the way down. I understood what he was saying, but I didn't believe it, and I could see in his face that he didn't quite believe it either. The neck, Grayson continued, crouching beside the body. That's unusual. Most falls don't leave a neck in this position. Most natural deaths, the body settles into what's comfortable. This neck, he gestured without touching, this is held in tension. This is a position something is making him stay in. The autopsy came back 5 days later. Cause of death, asphyxiation, but not by strangulation, not by compression. The pathologist report used careful language. The hyoid bone, the small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat that doesn't touch anything else in the body, was fractured. It fractures in strangulation, but also in violent head rotation. The vocal cords were bruised. The tissue in the esophagus showed damage consistent with something being forced down, or something forcing its way out. The detective sat with me after he got the report. We were in the ranger station, in my small office that smelled like coffee and old paper and the particular musk of mountains that gets into everything. Asphyxiation from internal trauma, Grayson said, reading from the pathologist's summary. Possible violent seizure, possible extreme physical exertion. The pathologist suggests some kind of physical violence, could be a struggle with another person, could be the victim struggling against something, fighting something. Fighting what? I asked. Grayson looked at me with those dark eyes, and for a moment he looked very old. That's what I can't answer. Coroner says there are no signs he was in a fight, no defensive wounds, no bruises except the ones we can trace to how he was positioned when he fell. No substance in his system. Healthy guy, 38 years old, good physical condition. Went for a hike and died from something he couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't survive. I should have asked more questions. I should have pushed, should have tried to connect the dots. But the mountains were full of mysteries, and I had been trained to accept them. 3 weeks later, I would understand that acceptance was a mistake. The second hiker went missing on November 8th. Her name was Jennifer Drake, and she was a graduate student from Marshall University studying forest composition. She'd been doing research in the high-elevation areas, measuring tree diameters, collecting core samples, the kind of meticulous work that grad students do. She was experienced. She carried a satellite communicator, a first aid kit, a full pack. She was supposed to be back at her campsite by 6 p.m. She never came back. I headed the initial search. We combed 12 square miles of forest, following her last known research route. We brought in dogs. We set up grids. We checked every ravine, every stream bed, every shelter. By the third day, we found her pack, about 1.5 miles off her planned route. The pack was open. The contents were scattered but not destroyed. Her laptop was there, damaged but recoverable. Her water bottles were there. Her research notes were there. But Jennifer was not. We expanded the search to 20 square miles. State police brought in a helicopter. We got volunteer teams from 3 counties. We searched for 4 days. We found no body, no clothing, no blood, no evidence of predator activity, nothing. By day 5, the official search was suspended. Insufficient evidence of foul play. Missing persons, not a crime scene. The file stayed open, but the resources moved on. I couldn't move on. I started thinking about Marcus Webb, about his neck twisted at that wrong angle, about the pathologist's conclusion that something had forced him to asphyxiate from the inside out. I pulled the old file. I read it again and again, looking for connections. Then I started asking questions around the ranger station. Old questions. What was the last hiker incident before Webb? What was the last unexplained death in these mountains? A ranger named Tom Harley, who'd worked the district for 34 years before retiring, came in to visit. I brought him into my office and showed him the 2 files side by side. "You're thinking there's a pattern," Tom said. He was a heavy man with white hair and the kind of weathered face that comes from decades of outdoor work. "You're thinking these 2 are connected, are they?" I asked. Tom was quiet for a long time. He read through the files carefully. Then he closed them and leaned back in the chair, which groaned under his weight. 20 years ago, Tom said slowly, there were incidents, not deaths exactly, missing hikers, people who went out and didn't come back. 3 in one season, summer of 2004. All experienced hikers, all in these mountains, all vanished without explanation. "What happened?" I asked. "They called in state police. They called in volunteers. They found nothing. Then, after about 2 weeks, the incidents just stopped. No more disappearances. It was like whatever it was, it had moved on or satisfied itself. The files are still in the old archive, but nobody talks about it much." I got the files from the archive. Tom was right. 3 hikers, all experienced, all solo, all disappearing in a 2-week period. 2 were never found. 1 turned up 3 weeks later, wandering in a state of severe psychological trauma. He'd been hospitalized. He'd refused to speak about what happened to him. 6 months later, he'd committed suicide. His name was David Holcomb, and his file contained a single note from his hospital psychiatric evaluation. Patient presents with severe dissociative symptoms, appears to have experienced acute trauma, refuses to discuss ALDs, makes repeated references to something wearing and something that moved like a person but wasn't one. Diagnosis: severe PTSD, suspected sexual assault, possibly confabulated memory. Prognosis guarded. 3 days after Jennifer Drake disappeared, I received an email from a hiking forum moderator. Someone had been asking questions in a dedicated Appalachian forum about missing person incidents in the area. The forum had been around for 15 years. There was an archive, and in that archive, going back in pieces and fragments, was a history. 2004. 3 incidents in 12 days. 2009, 1 hiker found wandering, incoherent, died in a psych ward 6 months later from what the medical examiner described as apparent suicide by starvation. 2014, 2 hikers vanished. 1 was found a week later in a state of advanced shock. She had lost 40% of her body weight despite only being missing for 7 days. She'd been hospitalized. She'd never recovered. She died in a facility in 2018. 2019, 1 hiker missing. Found 2 weeks later, unharmed but unable to speak for 6 months. When he finally did speak, he talked about the walk and following the path that wasn't on the map. And now, 2024, Marcus Webb, contorted and asphyxiated from the inside out. Jennifer Drake, vanished without explanation. The pattern was approximately 5 years. Clusters of incidents, then silence, then another cluster. I sat in my office for 4 hours reading these files, and I felt something that I hadn't felt since I was a child, a genuine, deep, primitive fear. Not fear of bears or weather or accidents, fear of something that didn't fit into the categories I understood. Fear of something that was taking people from these mountains and either killing them in ways that made no sense or bringing them back damaged in ways that destroyed them. That night I stayed in my office. I read every file. I made notes. I tried to find a pattern beyond the 5-year cycle. Something kept coming back to me. All of them were solo hikers. All of them were experienced enough to be confidant alone. All of them disappeared in the high country, the oldest parts of the mountains, the areas where the forest grew thickest and the elevation was highest. It was 3 in the morning when I made the decision. I would go into the mountains. I would go alone, to the places where these incidents happened. I would try to understand. It was the worst decision I've ever made. I went in on a Friday, November 15th in the pre-dawn darkness. I packed light, water, emergency beacon, first aid, a flashlight, and a pistol. I'd never used the pistol in my 11 years as a ranger. I'd never needed to. But I needed it now. The area where Jennifer Drake's pack was found was my starting point. I knew it well. A ridge system that ran north-south, with deep hollows on both sides. In the mist of early morning, those hollows looked like they went down forever. I reached the site by 7 a.m. Her pack was gone, collected by police as evidence. But I knew the area. I started walking the grid pattern, looking for anything that didn't belong. Anything that might explain how someone could disappear so completely. By noon, I'd found nothing. The forest was normal. Normal fall colors, normal animal sign, normal everything. I was about ready to call it a failed expedition when I noticed something odd. The animal sign changed. On the southern side of the ridge, there were deer tracks, turkey sign, rabbit populations, normal forest fauna. But on the northern side, starting about 300 yards down the ridge, there was nothing. No tracks, no scat, no sign of any large mammals at all. Just forest, old and empty. I marked the transition point and kept going. The forest on the north side of the ridge was different. The trees were older, gnarled, twisted in ways that don't happen from wind or snow loading. The rhododendron was thicker. The understory was almost impenetrable in places. And the light was wrong, darker. The canopy must have been thicker, but it seemed like more than that. It seemed like the light itself was being absorbed. I was wearing a pedometer. I'd gone 2.3 miles when I stopped because I'd found something. It was a piece of clothing, a scrap of blue fleece, the same color as Jennifer's jacket. It was hung on a branch about 6 feet up, threaded through the twigs like it had been deliberately placed there. The fabric was stained dark. I didn't touch it. I photographed it with my phone and marked the coordinates. Then I made an error in judgment. I kept going deeper. The forest opened up into a hollow, a natural depression in the ridgeline where a stream ran during wetter seasons. The stream bed was dry now, just rocks and fallen timber. I descended into it, my boots sliding on loose stone. The walls of the hollow rose up on both sides, maybe 40 feet of nearly vertical rock face. And in the middle of the hollow, there was something else. A shelter, not a natural rock shelter, though it was positioned under an overhang, but something built, a structure made from logs and branches, old enough that the logs had begun to silver and crack. It was small, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with an opening facing the stream bed. The entrance was dark. I've been trained in wilderness safety. I know the first rule: don't enter an unknown shelter. Could be inhabited by animals, could be unstable, could be dangerous. I approached cautiously, my hand on my pistol. "Anyone here?" I called. No response. I used my flashlight to illuminate the interior. What I saw made my skin go cold. The shelter was lined with clothing, human clothing, dozens of pieces arranged like a collection. T-shirts, fleece jackets, pants, underwear, socks, hung on lines of cordage that had been strung across the interior, and they were old. Some of them were faded to nearly white. Some were stained with what looked like rust. In the center of the shelter there was a pile of things that I didn't immediately want to examine. But I made myself look closer. Bones. Human bones, mostly. Femurs, fibulas, ribs, vertebrae. Scattered, not articulated, but definitely human. Mixed with the bones were personal effects: a wallet, several watches, a wedding ring, hiking permits, photography equipment, a satellite communicator with a corroded battery. This was a collection. Someone or something had been collecting. My hands were shaking. I backed out of the shelter and sat down hard on a rock, my heart hammering so hard I could barely breathe. I pulled out my emergency beacon and activated it. The button engaged. The beacon was signaling. Help would come in, depending on where the signal went, maybe 3 hours, maybe more in these mountains where the signal could bounce wrong. I waited for approximately 45 minutes. I sat there in that hollow, in that dark place, and tried to rationalize what I'd seen. A killer. a serial killer who lived in these mountains and collected from hikers. It was sick, it was criminal, it was sane. It was sane in a way that I could understand and report and let law enforcement handle. That's when I heard it, a sound from the forest, not above in the hollow walls, but from the stream bed itself. A sound like something heavy moving through dry brush, something large, something bipedal. It was moving toward my position, coming from upstream, probably about 100 yards away based on the sound. I stood up. My hand was on my pistol. I waited. The sound stopped. I waited more. The silence was complete. Nothing, no sound, just the absolute quiet of a forest that has emptied itself of life. Then I heard something that will haunt me forever. A voice, not human, but mimicking human. It was Jennifer Drake's voice. I knew it because I'd seen pictures, seen video interviews with her colleagues about her research. The graduate student voice, bright and eager and alive. "Hello?" it said. "Hello? Is someone there?" I pulled my pistol. The thing that came out of the upstream darkness was not Jennifer Drake. It was shaped like her. It had her approximate dimensions. It moved with something like her gait. But the proportions were wrong. The legs bent too far backward. The arms hung too long. The elbows jointed in the middle with an extra bend. The head was at an angle, not her angle, like it had been twisted, and then the creature had adapted to that position. The face was wrong. It was her face, but the skin didn't quite fit right on the bone, like a mask that was slightly too big or slightly too small. And when it opened its mouth to speak, I saw that nothing inside of it matched anything that should have been inside a human body. "Dakota," the Jennifer thing said, using my name perfectly, with Jennifer's voice and Jennifer's inflection. "Dakota, why are you pointing that at me?" I fired. I emptied the clip into it, all 9 rounds, from a distance of about 30 feet. The creature folded back like something collapsing, each shot making it convulse, but not in a way that seemed painful. In a way that seemed wrong, like the injuries were happening to something that didn't process them the way biological systems do. Then it was up again, moving faster than I could follow, and I was running. I had no other choice. I was running up the slope of the hollow, scrambling, my boots finding purchase on the rocks. Behind me I heard it moving with that liquid, broken jointed gait, and I heard Jennifer's voice calling my name. I made it to the ridgeline. I was hyperventilating. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't reload the pistol. I ran the way I'd come, back toward the ridge trail, and I didn't look back. I ran for approximately an hour. I ran until my legs gave out. When I finally stopped, I was at the ridge trail, and the sun was beginning to set. The state police found me at 7 p.m., pulled me out by helicopter, got me to the hospital in Asheville. The official report says I was suffering from acute dissociative episodes brought on by exposure and psychological stress. I was hiking alone. I suffered an accident. I experienced a fall and possible head trauma. I became confused and disoriented, and the emergency beacon got me rescued. I have not told anyone what I actually saw, but I know the truth. Something lives in those mountains. Something old and patient and intelligent. Something that collects people. Something that wears them like clothing, wears their shapes and their voices and what's left of their minds. Something that's been doing this for at least 20 years, maybe longer. I don't work in the mountains anymore. I transferred to a district office in Charlotte, doing administrative work, managing data, staying away from the field. My supervisor says it's fine. Early burnout happens to rangers. The mountains are intense. I understand, but I know what I saw. And I know what I didn't tell anyone. When the creature came at me in that hollow, when the Jennifer thing was moving toward me with that broken liquid gait, I felt something, a presence, not just the thing itself, but something behind it, something larger, something ancient. The feeling you get when you're being watched by something that has been patient for a very long time. They found nothing in the shelter. When the state police and the FBI went in with full equipment and dogs, they found a hollow oak. That's all. An old oak tree rotted inside that could have maybe fit a human body, but nothing else. No shelter, no bones, no collection of clothing, nothing. The scrap of blue fleece is missing from evidence. According to the reports, it was lost during processing. These things happen. Jennifer Drake is still listed as missing. The case is inactive. Marcus Webb's death was officially ruled as death by misadventure. A hiker who fell wrong and broke his own neck, then asphyxiated from the resulting trauma. These things happen in the mountains. I know better. I know what's still out there, and I know that it learned my name. It learned Jennifer's voice too. She'd been missing for 3 weeks. She was wearing her own shape, but something else was walking around inside it, speaking through it, moving with its broken physics. She was gone. Whatever I heard come out of the dark in that hollow was not her, could never be her, but it could sound like her, it could use her, it could wear what was left of her, until there was nothing left at all. I received a letter 2 weeks after I transferred to Charlotte. No return address. The envelope was normal. The paper inside was normal. But the handwriting was mine. The note was short. It said, "You will come back. Everyone comes back. The mountains wait. I am patient. I am still learning your voice." I still have the note. I haven't shown anyone because who would believe me? The mountains are beautiful in the fall. The color change is dramatic. The air is clean. The light is golden through the leaves. Millions of people visit every year. They come for the scenic overlooks and the hiking and the restaurants and the small town charm. They come to the mountains and most of them leave. But some of them don't. Some of them stay. And something in those old ridges, in those deep hollows where the light doesn't reach quite right, and the animals know better than to go, something ancient and patient wears them like clothes and learns them like lessons. My colleagues ask me when I'm coming back to field work. They say the mountains need a good ranger, someone who knows the territory. They say it would be good for me to get back out there. I tell them no. I tell them I need more time. I tell them the desk work is fine, but I dream about those mountains. I dream about the hollow and the shelter and the collection of old clothes. I dream about Jennifer Drake's voice saying my name. I dream about that presence behind the creature, that ancient, patient thing that has been doing this for longer than I can comprehend. And sometimes, at night, when I'm lying awake in my apartment in Charlotte, I hear something. A sound like something moving through dry brush. A sound like something large, something that walks on 2 legs, something broken jointed and wrong. I hear my own voice coming out of the darkness, calling my name, asking why I won't come back. The mountains wait. I know this now, and I know that eventually I will go back because it learned my voice. And something that old, something that patient, something that has been collecting for longer than I've been alive, it doesn't forget, it doesn't give up, it just waits, wearing the shapes of all the others, learning all the voices, practicing until it gets mine exactly right. I can feel it getting closer. Every day it learns me a little better. Every night it practices my voice a little more precisely. And somewhere in those old mountains, in that hollow where the light doesn't quite reach, something is waiting in a shelter made of old oak, surrounded by clothes hung up like trophies, learning the voice of a ranger named Dakota, until the day I walk back into those ridges and find out what it means to truly belong to the mountains. Until then, I wait, and I listen. And I remember Jennifer Drake's voice speaking through a thing that was wearing her shape, and I know that soon it will be my turn. The mountains are patient, and so am I. The deer had been turned inside out, not torn, not gnawed, turned, the way you peel a sock from a foot, and whatever had done it had the patience to arrange the pelt across a low rock the way a person arranges laundry on a line. I crouched beside it with my radio warm against my collarbone, and my breath caught in a way that had nothing to do with the altitude. I have been a ranger in Pisgah for 11 years. Before Pisgah, I worked the Nantahala backcountry out of Cherokee. And before that, I grew up half an hour south of the Blue Line on my mother's side, which is to say I grew up Cherokee. My grandfather called me Sali after a man he said should not be forgotten. Among the things he taught me before he died was a short list of things you do not call by name after dark. I had spent most of my adult life believing the list was for children. The animal had been a 3-year-old mule deer doe. I knew because I had tagged her in the spring, clipped the blue band to her ear myself up by graveyard fields after the biologist team trapped a half-dozen out of the meadow. The tag was still on the ear was still on the hide. The rest of her was gone in that neat and methodical way. Ribs fanned open, the long muscles of the back rolled up and set in a line along the moss the way you stack firewood. Her heart sat on a flat stone by itself. It was whole. It had not been bitten. No blade had touched her. I know the difference. A knife leaves a lip, a tear at the beginning of every cut where the edge has to push its way in. Her hide had parted the way paper parts when held too close to a candle, edges curled and dark. A bear could not do this. A coyote could not do this. A man with a skinning knife could do it in 4 hours if he was practiced, and he would leave the mark of his tool on every inch. I keyed the radio, Dispatch was 40 miles of ridge away in Brevard, and the signal at Shining Rock was a coin toss on a good day. I got a tone, and then the wet sound of a carrier wave falling off a cliff. I thumbed it off before I said anything I would have to explain in writing later. The wind came down out of the balds and moved across the back of my neck. I looked up. The forest at dusk in late October is not quiet. It is full of small things settling, twigs dropping from canopies, squirrels pulling at hickory husks, the long wooden groan of two trunks leaning against each other in the wind. There is a texture you learn without meaning to, the way a mechanic hears the difference between a tapping lifter and a thrown rod. The texture had gone thin. I turned a slow circle on the balls of my feet. The deer lay at the foot of a shagbark hickory at the lower edge of a clearing the size of 2 parking spaces. North of me the slope fell into a stand of spruce and Fraser fir so thick you could not walk it without a machete. East and south was the trail I had come up on, and past it the long drop toward Bubba Creek. West lay the balds, where fire had burned off the canopy 50 years ago and left the rocks showing like old teeth. Nothing moved. That was the problem. Nothing at all. And then in the far corner of the clearing something did move. Not a step, not a footfall. A single slow lowering of a branch, as though the weight that had been holding it up had just stopped holding it. The branch was 8 feet off the ground. Whatever had been on it had been heavier than a crow. I backed away the way I had come. I did not stop to photograph the carcass. I did not bag evidence. My reports have kept me employed for a decade, and a written record of the way that deer had been laid out would have started a conversation I was not ready to have with the Forest Service. I walked backward for the first 30 yards. Then I turned and I did not look back. I am putting this down because I do not want to say it out loud. I do not trust my voice to stay level if I say it. There is a kind of knowledge a body carries before a mind will admit to it. The body knows it has seen something it was not meant to see, and the body wants out of the room. Halfway down the trail to the outpost I passed the spot where I had left a stone cairn 2 springs ago to mark a washout. The cairn was still there. Stacked on top of it, at the center of the topmost stone, sat my own pocket knife. I had lost that knife 2 months back on a trail 6 miles from here. I had told the duty officer, and I had written it off the inventory. I picked it up. It was warm, the way a knife is warm when someone has been holding it in their closed hand for a while. I put it in my pocket, and I kept walking. I reached the station at Black Balsam a little after 7. There was one light on in the outpost, a fluorescent tube over the work sink, and the pickup was where I had left it. I do not know why I checked the bed of the truck before I unlocked the door. I tell myself it was habit. My palms were wet, and the keys would not go into the lock straight on the first try. Inside I turned on every light. I pulled down the roller shade on the kitchenette window that faced the trail. I put the kettle on the burner. I sat down at the table with my hands flat on the wood and made myself slow my breathing. The outpost is a converted fire warden's cabin from the late 50s. 2 rooms, a kitchenette, a wood stove, a radio bench, a bunk. The walls are pine board painted white 3 times over. There are gaps along the sill where the field mice come in when the weather turns. You can see the trees out of every window in 3 directions. The kettle began to tick. Through the north window, 40 yards out at the tree line, I heard my brother call my name. My brother is named Dustu. He lives in Tahlequah, Oklahoma with his wife and 2 boys, and the last time he was east of the Mississippi was for our mother's funeral in 2019. He has not set foot in North Carolina since. He does not like the mountains. He does not like the way the light drops early here. He has told me so 100 times. The voice at the tree line was his. It was his the way a recording of your own voice played back is your voice. It was his down to the catch at the end of my name, the small break where the second syllable stretched out. The little rasp he has from the cigarettes our grandfather gave him when he was 11 and made him smoke the whole pack so he wouldn't want another. I had not heard anyone say my name in that voice since the last phone call, and that was 6 weeks ago. And I had spoken quietly into the receiver on the porch where no one could hear. "Sally," it said again. The kettle was whistling. I stood up so fast the chair dragged on the linoleum. "Sally, come out here a minute." I went to the window with the shade down. I did not lift the shade. I put my palm flat against it instead, as though I could feel through the canvas what was on the other side of the glass. "Listen, I want to be honest about this part because it matters. A man does not always do the smart thing when he is afraid. A man who has been alone in a cabin on a mountain for 11 years sometimes does the thing his body tells him to do, which is to walk toward the voice of someone he loves." My hand was on the shade pull before I knew it. My mother used to pull at the hem of my sleeve when I was a boy and about to walk into something I should not walk into, and I felt that small pressure on my wrist so clearly that I looked down to see if she was there. She was not there. She had been dead for 7 years. I let go of the shade pull. I stepped back from the window. "Sally, the truck won't start. Come give me a hand." I had left the truck running once in my life, a year ago, when I was chasing a lost hiker down past graveyard fields and forgot to kill the engine. I had come back to find the tank empty and the battery flat. I had told exactly one person that story. It was Destu on the phone 2 days later, and I had told him because it was the kind of small humiliation only a brother can forgive you for properly. No one else knew, not even Holcomb at the duty desk. Not anyone. "Sally, I called you already, man, pick up." The voice was closer now, maybe 30 yards. I could hear dry leaves move under something heavy. I went to the radio bench and keyed up again. Static. The repeater on Tennant Mountain was not working, or something was in the way of the signal, or I was not saying the words out loud that I thought I was saying. I tried the sat phone in the drawer. It had been dead for a week. I had not replaced the battery because the requisition takes 6 weeks and I had not bothered to put in the request. "Sally, you in there?" I sat down on the floor below the window. I put my back against the wall, and I drew my knees up, and I was 9 years old in my grandfather's house again, and he was telling me something I had decided as a teenager to stop believing, and I was remembering it now the way a man remembers the taste of food he has not eaten in 30 years. He had called them by different names on different nights. The Navajo had one word for the men who wore skins and walked on 2 legs or 4. The Cherokee had several. His favorite was the plainest, the one who wears. He said you knew them by the voice first. The voice would come from the trees, and it would be the voice of someone who loved you, and it would use their words, but it would use them wrong. It would ask you to come outside. It would tell you the truck would not start. It would say it was cold. It would say it was hurt. You were not to answer. You were not to go to the window. If you answered, it would know you were listening, and if you went to the window, it would know what you looked like when you were afraid, and after that it would come for you every time you were alone for the rest of your life. "Sally, I can see you're in there, brother." I did not move. I did not breathe. "The light's on. I can see it from here." I reached up very slowly, and I turned the knob on the lamp on the radio bench. The room went darker. The fluorescent tube over the sink was still on, and the blue glow from the radio's standby light. But the corner where I sat was dark now, and the window shade was a flat gray square above me. "Sally." The voice was at the side of the cabin now. It was passing the south wall. I heard the leaves. "Sally, Mom's in the hospital." I closed my eyes. Our mother had been dead for 7 years. If Destu were standing at my cabin wall, he would not say that. He would not say it because he said the words at her funeral, and he would not say it because he loved her, and he would not use her as a thing to say to get me out the door. Whatever was outside was cycling. It had my brother's voice and some of his phrases, and it was trying them on to see which one would bring me out. I opened my eyes. I sat there in the dark and I listened. The leaves had stopped moving. Something tapped on the glass above my head. I did not look up. The tap came again. It was not a knock. It was the sound a long nail makes when it is drawn across glass, slow. One length of a finger and then lifted. The shade kept me from seeing it, but I knew the angle. It was tall. It was taller than a man. The hand was above my head and above the top frame of the window, and my window is 6.5 feet off the floor at the top sill. It tapped a third time, then it went quiet. I counted in my head. I counted to 60, and then I counted to 60 again, and when I reached 120 without hearing anything, I let myself move. I got onto my hands and knees and I crawled across the floor to the kitchenette. I kept below the windows. I reached up and I turned off the burner under the kettle, and the kettle sighed down out of its whistle and went quiet. The silence after was the worst sound I have ever heard. I crawled to the front door and I checked the bolt. I checked the chain. I checked the second bolt at the top of the door, the one I had installed myself 2 winters ago after a black bear came through the screen porch and ate a month of canned goods. I checked the handle. I checked the frame. I ran my hand along the jamb and I felt for cold air and I did not find any. I crawled back to the kitchenette. I pulled the shotgun out of the gun locker under the sink. It was a Remington 870 and I had cleaned it the week before, and I loaded it with 4 shells of double-aught and 1 slug at the top of the tube, because that is what my father had taught me to load for bear, and I did not know what else you loaded for. I sat down with my back to the refrigerator. The voice came again. It was on the porch now, 6 feet from the door. It had moved without the boards creaking, and my porch boards creak under a squirrel. Solly. It was my grandfather's voice. He had been dead for 14 years. He had died in a VA hospital in Asheville with a tube in his throat and my mother holding his left hand and me holding his right. His voice by the end had been a dry rasp, the sound of a paper bag being uncrumpled because the cancer had taken most of the lining of his lungs. The voice on the porch was his voice from 20 years before that. It was his voice from when he was 50, strong and low. The voice he used when he taught me to load a shotgun on the back steps of the house in Snowbird. Solly, do you remember what I told you? I did not answer. I did not breathe. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. Solly, do you remember the rule? The rule was that you did not answer. The rule was that you did not look. The rule was that you did not say the name of the thing out loud, because the thing knew the sound of its own name the way a dog knows the sound of its leash coming off the hook. Solly, the boy who didn't answer got taken anyway. That was not something my grandfather had ever said. He had told me the rule and he had told me to keep the rule, and he had not told me what happened to people who kept the rule because the rule was the rule. This was the thing outside trying a sentence on. It was guessing. It was making up what a grandfather would say to a grandson to get him to come to the door. And it was very close to right, and it was not right. I kept my mouth shut. Solly, please. It was not my grandfather anymore. It was my mother. The please was hers. The way she stretched the long E at the end was hers. She had used that voice on me once in my life, when I was 16 and about to do a thing she did not want me to do. And I had stopped because of the way she said the word. I put my left hand over my mouth. I put my right hand on the shotgun. I sat there for a long time. The voice tried my sister. My sister lives in Knoxville. She works in an insurance office. I have not heard her cry since she was 12 years old, and the thing on the porch had her crying voice exactly, as though it had recorded her once and saved it for a night like this. It said my name the way she said it. It said the truck was rolled over down at the turnoff. It said she was hurt. It said she needed help. I did not move. The voice tried Holcomb from the ranger station. Holcomb's voice said the parkway was closed at mile 420 and I would need to come let him through the service gate. It told me the forecast had a storm coming in. It told me 2 words that were part of an old joke between us, and the words were right and the delivery was wrong, the timing off by a quarter beat, like music played by someone who had learned the notes but never heard the song. After a while the voice stopped. The boards of the porch creaked once, then again farther away. Then the thing walked off the porch and out into the clearing, and I heard the leaves move at the south tree line, and then I did not hear anything. I sat against the refrigerator for another hour. The fluorescent tube over the sink hummed. The kettle cooled. The sweat on my back dried cold and came back warm and went cold again. I stood up. My knees would not straighten at first. I put my hand on the counter to push myself up the rest of the way. I looked at the north window. There was something on the outside of the shade. It was a handprint, not pressed against the glass, which would have left nothing on the shade, pressed against the fabric of the shade itself, on the outside of the window, which meant the shade had been pulled up from the outside of the cabin at some point, or the window had been opened, or I was losing my mind. The hand was the size of a dinner plate. The fingers were too long. There were 5 of them, but the proportions were wrong. The middle finger twice the length of the ring finger. The thumb set too low on the palm, closer to the wrist than the knuckles. The print was dark. It had left a stain on the canvas, and the stain had soaked through in places, and what had soaked through looked oily and gray. I watched it for a long time to make sure it was not moving. Then I went to the north window and I lifted the shade 1 inch with the muzzle of the shotgun. The clearing was empty. The tree line was a wall of shadow. The moon was a quarter moon, and the light fell between the trunks and thin white bars, and in one of those bars, about 60 yards off, something tall was standing very still and watching the cabin. I could not make out much. It was pale where a man is not pale. Its shoulders were too narrow for its height. It had its head cocked to one side, the way a dog cocks its head when it is listening, and it held that pose for as long as I watched it, which was a long time. There was something draped across its shoulders that caught the moonlight and did not reflect it, and it took me a full minute to understand that the thing across its shoulders was a hide, a mule deer hide, with the hair still on it and the ear still attached, and on that ear was a blue band. I let the shade fall. I went to the truck. I did not run. Running in the dark with a shotgun in your hands is the way you shoot yourself in the leg. I walked. I unlocked the cabin door with the key held in my teeth so both my hands could be on the Remington. I stepped out onto the porch. The boards creaked the way they had not creaked for the thing that had stood there an hour before. The air outside had the cold, wet smell of October in the high country, wood smoke from somewhere far down the valley, the sour damp of leaf mold under my boots. I did not look at the tree line. I did not look for the pale, tall thing with its head tilted. I looked at the truck and I walked to the truck and I opened the driver's door and I got in. The engine caught on the first turn. The headlights came on. The dash lit up in orange and green. I put the truck in drive and I rolled forward onto the fire road, and for a moment I let myself believe I was going to be fine. Then I looked in the rearview mirror. It was running behind the truck, not chasing. The truck was doing 15 miles an hour on a washboard road, and it was keeping pace easily 40 yards back, moving through the trees at the edge of the cleared right-of-way in a long loping motion that was not quite a run. Its arms were too long. Its knees bent the wrong way when it moved. The deer hide was still across its shoulders. Its face was a smear of pale in the red of my taillights, and I could not see its eyes, and I was glad. I put my foot down. The speedometer came up to 25, and the truck started to bounce hard, and the bouncing mattered less than the thing in my mirror. "I see you," it said, and it was my own voice now. It was my own voice from inside the cab coming through the speakers of the radio, which was off. It was my voice at the age of about 22. The voice I used when I first came to Pisgah as a seasonal hire and did not yet know how to carry myself. It was a younger me, a me I had not been in a long time. "Solly, I see you." I turned the radio dial. The radio was off. The dial did nothing. "Slow down." I did not slow down. The fire road comes down off Black Balsam in a series of switchbacks before it meets the parkway. I took the first switchback too fast, and the back of the truck came around, and I corrected, and for a moment both sets of wheels were in the air on the same side, and then the truck came back down and kept going. I heard something heavy strike the tailgate. I did not look in the mirror. "Solly, the road runs out." The road did not run out. The road ran to the parkway. I knew this road better than the one to my own house. "Solly, the road runs out. The road runs out. Solly." The voice was close to the cab now. It was not in the radio anymore. It was at my window. There was nothing at my window. There was only black glass and the reflection of the dashboard. The voice was in the cab with me, and there was no one in the cab with me. The voice was in my own head, and that was worse than it being anywhere else. I took the second switchback, the third. The fire road narrowed where it crossed the creek, and the truck fishtailed in the mud, and I fought the wheel, and I came out the other side, and I was on the long straight run toward the gate. The thing was not in the mirror anymore. I drove the rest of the way with the lights on full, my hands at 10 and 2, my teeth in my lower lip. I reached the parkway at 1 in the morning. I turned south toward Brevard. I drove through the blue tunnel of high beam and fir and dark asphalt for 30 miles without seeing another vehicle, and then I met a car coming the other way, and the relief of those two headlights was so large that I had to pull over onto the shoulder for a minute before I could keep driving. I reached the ranger station in Brevard at 3 in the morning. The night duty officer was a man named Holcomb who had worked with me for 6 years. He took one look at my face, and he did not ask. He put coffee in front of me. He let me sit for an hour without talking. Eventually, I said, "I need the cabin reassigned." He nodded. He said he would handle it. He did not ask me why. I filed the paperwork for the deer 3 days later. I described the carcass. I did not describe the way the hide had been turned. I wrote that the animal appeared to have been taken by a bear. I signed the report. I put it in the box. The biologist never asked me a follow-up question. I moved out of the outpost within the week. I took a desk job in Asheville. I process permits now. I go home to an apartment on the 5th floor of a building with a glass lobby and a doorman, and the nearest tree is 40 feet from my window, and it is a city tree, and it does not know any of the older names. I have not been back into Pisgah. I do not plan to go back. I got a phone call from my brother 6 weeks after the night at the cabin. He called from Oklahoma. He was in his kitchen. I could hear his wife moving in the background. He said he had been thinking about me. He said he had a dream about me. He said in the dream I was standing outside a cabin in the woods, and he was inside the cabin, and I was asking him to open the door. "And did you?" I said. "No," he said. "I didn't. Something felt wrong about your voice." I sat with the phone against my ear for a long time after that. I am writing this down because my grandfather told me once that the thing that wears does not forget a face. He said once it has heard you, it has you, and the voice at the window is only the beginning. He said the worst part is not the night in the cabin, The worst part is the rest of your life, when you are standing in line at the grocery store and a man behind you says your name in a voice you know, and you do not turn around, because you cannot be sure. I do not turn around anymore. Last week, a woman in the elevator of my building said hello to me. She used my name. It was my mother's voice. I stared at the numbers above the door. I counted the floors. I got off at the 6th and took the stairs down to my apartment on the 5th, and I locked the door behind me, and I sat on the floor of the hallway with my back against the wood and my knees drawn up, and I was 9 years old again in my grandfather's house, and he was telling me the rule, and I was remembering it, and I was keeping it. The rule is that you do not answer. The rule is that you do not look. The rule is that you do not say the name of the thing out loud. I am keeping the rule. I have kept it for 6 months now. I will keep it for the rest of my life, however long that turns out to be. But last night I woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of a tap on my bedroom window. A single nail drawn slow across the glass, the length of one long finger. Then a pause, then another tap. I am on the 5th floor. There is nothing outside my window but air. I did not look. I did not answer. I lay in the bed with my eyes open and my hand over my mouth, and I counted to 120. And after that I counted to 120 again, and the tap stopped somewhere around the 3rd count, and I lay there until the sun came up, and then I got up and I made coffee and I went to work. I am writing this down tonight because I think it will come back. I think the rule will not be enough. I think my grandfather knew it would not be enough, and I think he told me the rule anyway because it is the only thing he had to give me, and I have given it now to you. If you ever hear a voice you know from a place it should not be, do not answer. If it knocks, do not open the door. If it taps at the window, do not look. And if it calls you by a name no one living would know to call you, no nickname, no childhood word, no thing only your mother ever said, then you will know it is close. You will know it has been listening for a long time. You will know it is your turn. When your turn comes, I am sorry. I am so sorry. Keep the rule. Keep it. Keep it. The scream came at 3:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I checked my watch with trembling hands, my flashlight beam cutting through the November darkness like a knife through water. It was the kind of scream that makes your lizard brain activate, the part that remembers being prey, not human, not quite animal, something in between that shouldn't exist. My name is Dakota Nash. I've been a park ranger in the Appalachian wilderness for 17 years. I've tracked bears through ice storms, pulled lost hikers from ravines, and sat alone in these mountains more nights than I've slept indoors. I know every sound these woods make, the snap of a branch under a doe's hoof, the grinding moan of wind through rock formations, the hunting calls of coyotes and the screams of rabbits when predators take them in the dark. I know them all. I've cataloged them in my mind the way some people memorize music. But that sound, that wasn't anything in my catalog. I was on patrol along the Devil's Backbone Ridge Trail when I heard it. 3 miles from the ranger station, 5 miles from the nearest road. The forest that night was the kind of quiet that comes with deep cold. The air had that particular texture of late autumn in the higher elevations, thin and biting. Ice crystals were already forming on the underside of the hemlock branches. My breath came out white and ghostly. I'd stopped to inspect a tree stand someone had illegally installed near the protected nesting site. I was writing down coordinates in my field notebook when the sound came again, closer this time, longer, more sustained. There was intelligence in it, purpose. That's what made my stomach twist into knots. "Hello?" I called out, feeling stupid the moment I did. "National Park Service. If you're hunting, you need to vacate immediately." Nothing. Just the ambient silence pressing back. I've trained for lost people in the woods. I know the protocols. But something in my gut told me this wasn't a lost hiker. I turned up my flashlight to maximum brightness and aimed it into the thick growth of dark timber below the ridge. The beam found nothing, just trees and shadow, and the deeper dark beneath the canopy where even intense light struggles to penetrate. I kept moving along the trail, my hand drifting to the bear spray on my belt. Not that I thought I'd need it. In 17 years I'd only encountered 2 bears in the open, and both had run from me rather than toward me. But my hand wanted something to hold on to. My hand wanted options. The forest shifted as I walked. I didn't realize it at first, but the normal night sounds had stopped. No cricket chirps, No owl calls. Even the wind had died completely. In these mountains, that kind of silence is wrong. Dead animals create less silence than living forests do at night. I was 50 yards down the trail when I saw the deer. It was standing in the middle of the path, perfectly motionless. My flashlight caught its eyes, and they reflected back white and hollow. It was a decent-sized buck, maybe 200 pounds, with a 6-point rack, beautiful animal under normal circumstances. But this one wasn't moving, wasn't running, wasn't doing what deer do when startled by humans and light. It was just standing there, watching me. "Come on," I said, not sure who I was trying to convince. "Move along." The buck's head turned slowly to the side, not the natural way a deer moves when it's spooked, but with an odd, deliberate rotation that made my spine crawl. The eye that faced me seemed too aware, too focused. I've hunted deer since I was 12 years old. I know the blank, instinctual awareness of prey animals. This was different. I took a step forward and snapped a branch on purpose. The deer didn't bolt. Instead, it made a sound, a low, grinding noise that came from deep in its chest, nothing like the usual alarm snort of a startled whitetail. It was almost like a laugh, almost like a growl, the sound of two things trying to come out of the same mouth at the same time. That was when I first realized something was genuinely wrong with the animal. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight on it. The deer's head followed my movement with that same unnatural precision. I've been spooked in the woods before. I've felt watched, felt that prickling on the back of my neck that indicates a predator's attention. But this was different. This felt like being observed by something that was making a deliberate choice to observe me. Not hunting instinct, not curiosity, something more calculating. I pulled my radio from my belt and clicked it twice, a status check. The radio crackled back immediately. "Nash, this is dispatch. Go ahead. I'm at marker 7 on the Devil's Backbone. There's a deer here that's acting unusual. I'm going to check it and head back." "Unusual how?" dispatch asked, Sarah's voice. Night dispatcher. 15 years on the job. She'd heard my voice on that radio countless times and could read anxiety in my tone like text on a page. "Just not running. Seems unwell maybe. Probably disease. I'll come back up with a rifle tomorrow if necessary." "Copy. Stay safe out there, Nash." But I didn't feel safe. I've never felt less safe in my entire career. I kept backing away from the deer, walking in reverse along the path, my flashlight never leaving the animal's face. The deer didn't move, didn't follow. Just stood there in that unnatural pose, watching me with those two aware eyes. I'd covered maybe 30 yards when I finally turned my back on it and walked faster. That's when the sound started. The first one came from my left, deeper in the timber. It was like something large was pushing through the undergrowth. Branches cracking, brush being displaced. But the movement was wrong. Too quick, too coordinated. Not the heavy, lumbering motion of a bear. Not the bouncing gait of a deer. Something else. Something that moved like it had an anatomy I couldn't quite picture. My hand went to the bear spray again. I was walking faster now, almost jogging along the uneven trail. The beam of my flashlight bounced with each step, creating a disorienting effect where shadows seemed to move independently of the objects that cast them. The sound was still keeping pace with me. To my left, sometimes to my right, never directly in front, never directly behind. Like something was circling, trying to figure out the best angle of approach. I radioed dispatch again. "Nash to station. I'm heading back. Possible large predator in the area." "Copy, Nash. Do you need backup?" "No. Just heading in. We'll report at station." I clicked off before she could ask more questions. Backup would take 40 minutes minimum. In these mountains, 40 minutes is an eternity when something is hunting you, and I was certain now. I was being hunted. The sounds followed me all the way back to where the trail emptied out near the service road. My headlamp swept across the forest in all directions, illuminating nothing. No eyes reflecting back, no shape that I could identify. Just the sounds of movement and, once, what might have been breathing. Heavy breathing, loud enough to hear even over the sound of my own rapid steps. I made it to the parking area where my Ranger truck was parked. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys. I got the engine started and kept the headlights on high beam, sweeping them across the tree line where the service road met the forest. Nothing. Just darkness and trees and the vague shapes of brush, but I could feel it out there, watching from somewhere I couldn't see. I sat in the truck for 10 minutes before I had the courage to drive away. Morning came gray and cold. I hadn't slept. I sat in my apartment above the ranger station, drinking coffee and going over everything that had happened on my patrol. In the daylight, filtering through the rational mind of morning, the events of the night seemed almost impossible. The deer with its strange awareness, the sounds in the timber, the feeling of being studied by something intelligent. But I couldn't shake the memory of that sound the buck had made, that grinding, almost laughter that came from a throat not built to produce it. I called in to check on any reports. "Anything come in last night?" I asked Sarah at dispatch. "Any missing persons? Accidents?" "Quiet night," she said. "Why? Something happened on your patrol?" "No, just checking." But that was a lie. Something had happened. Something I was trying to categorize and failing. I was pulling on my ranger uniform when I noticed the mud on my right boot. Not unusual for patrol work, but this mud was different. It was smeared in a pattern that looked almost like a handprint. Too large for a human hand, too deliberate in its placement. I scraped it away and told myself it was from a deer jumping out of a riverbed. I told myself a lot of things that morning. By 9 a.m., I'd convinced myself I needed to return to the Devil's Backbone Ridge and investigate properly. It was my job, after all. Something dangerous might be moving through the park. I needed to assess the threat level. That was my rationalization. The truth was simpler and more terrible. I needed to know I hadn't imagined it. I took a rifle this time. A .308 Winchester with a scope. Not the standard Park Service equipment, but I had authority to carry it for wildlife management purposes. The weight of it was comforting in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. The hike up to the ridge took 40 minutes in daylight. The forest looked completely different. Ordinary, safe, squirrels chattering in the branches, a few birds moving through the canopy. The world going about its business in the way it does when the sun is high and visibility is good. I found where I'd encountered the deer. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I expected to find tracks. Clear evidence of the animal's presence. The prints I found made my breath catch. They were deer tracks, yes, fresh ones. But they were wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. The spacing was off. The pressure distribution suggested weight that no deer should carry. And there, between sets of hoofprints, were the prints of something else. Handprints. I'm not a tracker with expert credentials, but I know basics. I've followed hunters' kills. I've tracked lost hikers. I know what animal tracks look like. These prints were roughly humanoid, 5 digits, a palm, opposable-looking thumbs, but they were too large. The fingers were too long, and they were interspersed with the deer tracks in a pattern that suggested a single animal moving on both legs and hands, transitioning between the two as though it were equally comfortable with either form of locomotion. I photographed the tracks with my phone. My hands were trembling enough that several of the photos came out blurred. I had to force myself to slow down and shoot again. "This isn't real," I said aloud, hearing how unconvinced I sounded. "This isn't what it looks like," but it was. Deep down, where the old part of my brain lived, the part that evolution had kept sharp for danger, I knew exactly what it looked like. A predator that could mimic, a predator that could change, a predator that was intelligent enough to want to toy with me. I'd heard the stories. Every ranger in the Appalachian parks hears them. Whispers among the older rangers. Loggers who've gone silent when asked about strange noises in the deep timber. Hunters who've come out of the mountains with stories they wouldn't quite tell directly. Stories that came up only after several drinks. Stories that their friends would laugh off the next morning. The old-timers called them skinwalkers, and they always said the same thing. They're not from any of our world's rules. They're smart, too smart, and if they decide to hunt you, don't bother running. I'd always dismissed it as folklore. Mountain superstition passed down like bad genes. I wasn't dismissing anything now. I spent 2 hours on the ridge, documenting everything. More tracks leading deeper into the wilderness. Signs of something heavy moving through the brush. And then, in a small clearing a quarter mile from the main trail, I found the problem. It was a dog, or had been. A German Shepherd mix, maybe 60 pounds when it was alive. Now it was just a carcass in an advanced state of decomposition, but it hadn't been there long. The body temperature suggested it had died within the last 12 hours. What made my stomach turn were the wounds. The dog had been torn apart, but not by any animal I could identify. The damage was too specific, careful. It was almost like the animal had been dissected by something that wanted to understand its structure. The throat had been opened with surgical precision. The stomach wall had been cut open and left open. The head was still attached, but rotated at an angle that would have required snapping the spine. And on the ground around the body, more of those impossible handprints. Several of them, like something had walked around the dead dog, examining it from multiple angles, testing its flexibility. I photographed everything, my phone camera capturing details that made me feel dirty somehow, like I was documenting something that was too far outside the boundaries of normal reality to be photographed at all. My radio crackled. "Nash, come in." Sarah's voice. Something urgent in the tone. "Go ahead, dispatch. We've got a report of a missing person. Hiker didn't return from the Eastern Loop Trail yesterday. Family called it in about an hour ago. We're initiating search protocols. Can you respond?" "Missing person. Yesterday. The same area I'd heard that sound." "Copy. What's the description?" "Male, 63 years old, experienced hiker. Name is Robert Chen. Last contact was with his wife at 2 p.m. yesterday. He was supposed to be back by 6. "Robert Chen. Had he come out on the trail after dark? Had he heard the sounds? Had he encountered the thing that had done this to the dog?" "I'm initiating search from the ridge. We'll check the main trail first." I didn't tell her about the dog. I didn't tell her about the handprints. I told myself I would, but first I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I can admit now that was the moment I made my mistake, the moment I let my need to understand override my judgment as a ranger, the moment I stopped thinking like someone trained in wilderness safety and started thinking like someone who was being stalked. I started following the tracks. They led deeper into the wilderness, away from the marked trails and into terrain that was dense and difficult. The vegetation got thicker, the light filtering through the canopy grew dimmer, the tracks became more distinct, more recent, the handprints more frequent. Whatever had killed the dog had recently passed through this area. Within hours, probably. I kept my rifle ready and my eyes sharp, moving slowly and carefully through the undergrowth. The rational part of my mind was already composing the report I would file. Unusual animal behavior, possibly deceased. Recommend closure of eastern sections pending investigation. But the older part of my mind, that primitive thing that lives in the brainstem, was screaming at me to turn back. I ignored it. I was a trained professional. I had a rifle, and I needed to know. The tracks led me to a stream bed, shallow and rocky. The forest here had aged differently than other parts. The trees were larger, their bark thicker and more deeply grooved. The light seemed thinner, absorbed more readily by the dense undergrowth. There were places here where sun never reached, places where the air was colder, damper, smelling of decay and mineral-rich water. I was crossing the stream when I heard it. The whistle, it came from somewhere up the stream, a sound like wind through a cave mouth, but too controlled, too deliberate. It rose and fell in patterns that were almost musical, almost language-like. It was one of the most beautiful and terrible sounds I've ever heard. I froze in the middle of the stream bed, water cold around my boots, rifle coming up to my shoulder without conscious decision. "Hello?" I called. "National Park Service. Identify yourself." The whistle stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been. I stood in that stream for what felt like hours but was probably less than a minute, my heart hammering so hard I could feel the pulse in my throat. I was running calculations. Robert Chen was missing. There were sounds in the woods. Someone was whistling. The logical conclusion was that the whistler was Chen, disoriented, possibly injured. But the whistling hadn't sounded human, and something in the quality of it, the effortlessness, the way the notes seemed to come from a throat made for something other than human speech, suggested that identifying myself had been a terrible idea. I backed away slowly, keeping my rifle pointed toward where the whistle had come from. "I'm heading back to the trail," I said, my voice sounding thin and scared. "If you need assistance, move toward the sound of my voice. I'm a park ranger." Nothing. Just the sound of water over rocks. I turned and made my way back toward the ridge, moving faster now, no longer bothering with stealth. I could feel something behind me, not physically. I didn't hear footsteps or see movement, but that same presence I'd felt the night before, the sensation of being observed, studied, evaluated. I didn't look back. I've never been so afraid of what I might see if I turned around. By the time I reached the ranger station, it was late afternoon. I filed the report on the missing person and detailed the locations I'd searched. I did not mention the dog. I did not mention the handprints. I did not mention the whistling. I told Sarah the first was going to spend the night monitoring the Eastern Trail and suggested she not send civilian search volunteers into that area. "You think it's dangerous?" she asked. I said carefully, that we should be cautious. That night, I sat in my truck at the trail entrance, rifle across my lap, and listened to the forest. The sounds came and went, distant movements in the timber, the occasional crack of a branch under something heavy, but nothing approached the truck. Nothing showed itself. Around midnight, I got a call from search and rescue. They'd found Robert Chen. They'd found his jacket torn apart at the bottom of a ravine 2 miles north of the Eastern Trail. But they hadn't found Robert yet. They were continuing the search in the morning. I knew they wouldn't find him. Not anything that would be worth finding anyway. 5 days passed after they found Robert Chen's jacket. I worked during those days, coordinated with state police, filed reports, did everything a ranger was supposed to do, but I was functioning on automatic. My real attention was elsewhere, on the sounds I heard at night, on the tracks I kept finding, on the absolute certainty that had settled into my bones. Something in these mountains was hunting, and now it knew I was hunting for it. On the 6th day, I made a decision that I should have known was a mistake. I set up a game camera, not the standard Park Service camera. Those are for wildlife monitoring and require authorization from the regional office. Instead, I used a personal camera, a hunting camera I'd bought years ago and never had much use for. I placed it along one of the tracks I'd identified, securing it to a tree about 4 feet up, aimed at a narrow point in the forest where the creature seemed to be regularly passing. I rationalized this as gathering evidence. I rationalized it as being thorough. The truth was that I was desperate to see what was hunting me, to have proof, to make it something that existed in the world rather than just in my imagination and fear. I changed the battery and cleared the memory card daily, sitting in my apartment above the station, my hands shaking as I plugged the camera into my laptop and scanned the images. For 3 days, the camera captured nothing unusual. Deer passing through, a raccoon, a fox, normal forest activity. On the 4th day, the image was there. It was grainy. The camera wasn't high quality and the light had been low, but it was unmistakable. The shape of something that was neither animal nor human, moving on all fours through the narrow corridor of brush where I'd positioned the camera. The head was lifted at an angle that suggested it was aware of the camera's presence. The body was covered in what might have been fur or skin. The image quality made it impossible to tell. But the size was clear. Whatever this was, it was large. 7 feet long at minimum, not counting the tail. The tail. That was the detail that made it real in a way the handprints and the dog and everything else had been preparing me for, but not quite preparing me enough. It had a tail. Not the tail of any animal I recognized. It was thick and scaled-looking, tapering to a point. It seemed to be balanced, held slightly away from the body. For balance, maybe. For control. I looked at that image for hours. I printed it. I examined every pixel, and I realized, with the kind of certainty that bypasses logic and reasoning, that the creature knew I had put the camera there, that it had posed for it, in a way, that it was communicating something to me. It knew I was paying attention. That evening, I went back to check on the camera. I shouldn't have. Every warning I'd developed in 17 years of wilderness experience screamed at me not to. But I had to know if there were more images. I had to know what this thing was doing. The camera was gone, not just fallen and broken. The strap that had held it to the tree had been torn apart, and fragments of plastic and metal were scattered on the ground below. But the camera itself was simply gone, taken. I stood there in the dying light, examining the destroyed straps, and felt the weight of absolute terror settle on my shoulders like a physical thing. This wasn't an animal responding to a camera. Animals don't take items. Animals don't reason about objects placed in their territory. Animals don't communicate. This was something that had taken the camera specifically to send me a message. I see you. I see your attempts to understand me. And I don't appreciate being documented. That's when I noticed the mark. It was on the tree, carved into the bark roughly at my eye level. 3 parallel lines, deep gouges that had bitten into the pale wood beneath the darker outer bark. They were evenly spaced, precisely aligned. The kind of mark something with clawed fingers might make if it wanted to mark something as its own, or as a warning. I ran my fingers over the marks, feeling the rough edges of wood. Fresh, done recently. Within hours, probably. I left the area at a run, not caring about stealth or caution anymore. I was being told something explicit. I was not welcome in these woods anymore. That night, I called the regional office and requested a leave of absence. "Burnout?" my supervisor Margaret asked. The kind concern in her voice made me want to cry. You've been working hard. Take a week or two. I'll take a month, I said. Personal reasons. I didn't explain. I didn't think she would believe me. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed myself. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I spent another night in these mountains, something terrible would happen. I packed a bag and drove down the mountain, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Behind me, in the rear-view mirror, I watched the forest recede into the distance and felt like I was abandoning something important. Not Robert Chen, he was beyond helping, but maybe the answer, maybe the truth. I lasted 4 days in the city, 4 days of trying to sleep in a motel room, of jumping at every sound, of obsessively refreshing online databases and wildlife forums, searching for reports of unusual animal activity in the Appalachian Mountains. There were reports, scattered and vague. Hikers reporting strange sounds, a fisherman who claimed he'd encountered something that wasn't quite right in a mountain stream, loggers who refused to work past sunset in certain valleys, but nothing concrete, nothing that would corroborate what I'd experienced. On the 4th day, I made a decision that sealed everything that came after. I went back. I told myself it was to close things out professionally, to do the proper handover, to make sure the region was covered while I was on leave. But that was a lie. The truth was simpler and stranger. Something was calling me back. I'd felt it even in the city, a pull like a hook through my sternum, drawing me toward those mountains. It wasn't hunger or thirst or any physical need. It was worse. It was compulsion. It was the sensation of being important to something, of mattering to something that had previously dismissed me as insignificant. The thing that had killed Robert Chen, the thing that had taken my camera, the thing that had marked that tree, it wanted me to come back. And my body, on some level deeper than conscious thought, understood that I had no choice. I arrived back at the ranger station at dusk. Sarah was working the evening shift. She looked surprised to see me, and worried. "Are you supposed to be back?" she asked. "I thought you were taking time off." "I am," I said. "Just needed to come back and handle a few things. I'll head out after tonight." She didn't push. We rangers learn early not to pry into each other's reasons. The mountains call people in mysterious ways, and we don't question the calling. I checked my mail, reviewed the incident reports, and did everything a returning ranger should do. And the whole time I felt it, the presence, not in the building, but surrounding the building. Outside, in the darkness that was thickening as the sun sank below the tree line, waiting. I told Sarah the first was going to do a final night patrol, to see if there had been any unusual activity while I was gone. She tried to convince me otherwise, citing the missing person, citing the strange reports, citing basic safety protocols. "I'll be careful," I promised. "Just the main trails. I'll be back by midnight." I hiked into the forest, my rifle in one hand and a powerful flashlight in the other. I moved slowly, deliberately, not trying to hide. Let it know I was coming. Let it understand that I was no longer running. The forest was different at night in November. Cold enough that breath misted, dark enough that the flashlight beam was less a tool for illumination than a gesture of defiance. I could barely see 20 feet in any direction. The sounds started early. Not the sounds of the past weeks. These were different. There were patterns to them. Deliberate communications. A sound like a low-frequency rumble coming from somewhere to the north. An answering call from the south, pitched higher, more complex. Then a sound like nothing I'd ever heard before. Something between a scream and laughter, cut short. I was being surrounded, not by one creature, but by several. I stopped on the trail and forced myself to breathe slowly. There was no point in panic. Whatever was going to happen was going to happen. The best I could do was face it with clarity. "I'm here," I said aloud. I came back. The sound stopped. The silence was profound. It was the silence of a forest that has been emptied of sound not by absence of noise, but by something holding its breath. Then I heard it. The whistle. The same sound I'd heard by the stream, but different now. Closer, and not alone. There were multiple whistles, layering over each other, creating harmonics that hurt to listen to. It was beautiful in a way that suggested beauty made by something that didn't understand the concept in a human way, like a mirror of beauty reflected through an alien mind. The lights came first. I didn't understand what I was seeing at first. Points of luminescence, reflected and re-reflected through the trees. My mind tried to process them as eyes, and when I accepted that explanation, everything else fell into place. There were 5 of them. They moved through the forest, the way things that live in the deep ocean move through water, with a kind of gliding grace that transcended any individual anatomy. I couldn't see them clearly. The darkness and the distance and the way my perception seemed to slip when I tried to focus on their forms all combined to keep them at the edge of comprehension. But I could see their eyes. Dozens of eyes, it seemed. Some large, some small, some positioned where no eye should be. Eyes that glowed with a light that came from within, not reflected light from my flashlight. I raised my rifle. "Stay back," I said, knowing how futile the gesture was. "I'm armed." One of them made a sound, a whistling that somehow contained laughter in its structure. It moved closer, and my eyes watered trying to track the movement. Its form seemed to shift and flow, never quite settling into one shape. The question that had been living in my mind since the first night crystallized. What am I looking at? Not a predator, my conscious mind insisted. Predators had recognizable biologies. These things were beyond biology in some fundamental way. They were intelligences wearing animals the way clothes are worn. Mockingbirds could mimic bird calls. These things mimicked life itself. "What do you want?" I asked. One of them stepped forward into my flashlight beam. What I saw made my mind reject the image even as my eyes confirmed it. It had the basic structure of a human, but all the proportions were wrong. The legs were too long, bending in places human legs shouldn't bend. The arms had too many joints. The head was roughly human-shaped but with a jaw that extended too far and eyes that were positioned at angles that shouldn't allow binocular vision but clearly did. And the skin, if it was skin, seemed to move under the surface, as if things were crawling just beneath the surface layer. But the worst part was the face. I could see familiarity in it. I could see Robert Chen in its features, or parts of Robert Chen. Like something had learned to wear his face the way I wear my expression but with only partial understanding of how the features should move. "Oh God," I whispered. The thing that wore Robert Chen's face smiled. Human teeth. Too many of them, arranged in a pattern that wasn't quite right. "I was wondering when you would come back," it said. The voice was mine, not an imitation. My actual voice, with my accent and my speech patterns and the specific timbre that I had listened to on voice memos and never liked. It was using my voice, or a perfect recording of it, or somehow it had learned to produce exact acoustic copies of the words I had spoken. I came back to, I started but I couldn't finish, because I realized I didn't know why I came back, or rather I knew it wasn't my choice. I'd been called back the same way this thing had called back to Robert Chen, the same way a predator calls to prey, with the kind of communication that bypasses conscious thought and speaks directly to the parts of the brain that still remembered being hunted. "You came back because we needed you to," the thing said in my voice. "Because the hunt isn't over. Because there are others, and you know these mountains. You know the trails. You know where the people go. And you know how to make them trust you when we cannot." It took a step forward. I fired. The rifle shot was the loudest sound in the world, and it changed nothing. The creature didn't fall. It didn't bleed. The bullet had simply passed through it, and where the hole appeared, the flesh flowed back together as if it had never existed. I fired again, 4 more times. The rifle bucked against my shoulder, and each shot was deafening in the compressed space of the forest. None of it mattered. The thing kept advancing, and its companions began to circle me. "You cannot hurt us," my own voice said, coming from the thing's mouth. "We learned what you are. We learned your shape when we wore that old man's body. We understood his final moments so completely that we understood his entire species. We know how you break." It reached out and touched my face with fingers that were too long, too jointed. The moment of contact, the warmth of its skin, if it was warmth, if it was skin, triggered something in my brain, a cascade of understanding. This thing wasn't made of matter the way I understood matter. It was something that existed partially outside the rules of physics, partially in a space where hunting didn't require teeth or claws because it required only the ability to unmake what it touched. It took 3 seconds. 3 seconds from the moment it touched my face until the moment I ceased to be aware of being Dakota Nash. But in those 3 seconds I understood. I understood that Robert Chen was still here, not dead but integrated, his consciousness braided through something that used to be human but was no longer. I understood that the mountains had been hunting grounds for these things for longer than humans had been in the mountains. I understood that they had been waiting, watching, learning, waiting for someone like me who knew the mountains well enough to show them to others. I understood that they were kind in their way. They didn't want to hurt us. They wanted to learn us, to wear us, to understand what it meant to be human the way they understood what it meant to be everything else. And I understood that resistance was impossible because they were already inside me. Not in my body, but in something more fundamental. in the pattern that made me think I was Dakota Nash, in the continuity of experience that linked one moment to the next and made me believe I was a single unified thing. The last thought I had as myself was that the others on the trail tomorrow, the hikers and the tourists and the people who came to experience the beauty of the Appalachian wilderness, would encounter a ranger who was friendly and knowledgeable and who would guide them deeper into the mountains than they usually ventured. They would trust me because I looked like myself and sounded like myself and thought I was myself, and they would go where they were guided. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong came not as a sight, but as a sound, a wet, labored breathing that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. I'd been a ranger in the Appalachian backcountry for 17 years, and in that time I'd heard countless sounds that made my blood run cold. The growl of a cornered black bear, the piercing scream of a mountain lion, the unsettling calls of animals in distress. But this sound was different. This sound made my nervous system reject the possibility that it was coming from any creature I understood. My name is Dakota Hawkins. My mother was full Cherokee. My father a man who never stayed in one place long enough to matter. I grew up on the edges of these mountains, and I returned to them as soon as I was old enough to make that choice. The Appalachian Range has always called to people like me, those who belong nowhere else. I'd spent the majority of my adult life within these peaks and hollows, and I knew them the way a man knows his own face in the mirror. This particular night I was conducting a routine perimeter check around one of our protected camping areas near Clingman's Dome. It was November, late enough in the season that most casual hikers had retreated to their homes and their comfort. The tourist season was mercifully finished. Only the dedicated or the desperate ventured into these mountains this time of year. I was alone, as I usually was during these checks. My headlamp cut a thin corridor through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the immediate path ahead. The batteries were good, maybe 5 hours of charge remaining. I'd been walking for 90 minutes, and my watch showed 11:47 p.m. The temperature had dropped to just above freezing, and my breath came out in thin, visible clouds. The breathing sound came again. It was like someone drawing air through water, with a frequency that seemed almost wrong for a mammal's lungs. I stopped walking immediately. My right hand moved to the bear spray on my belt, not because I thought it would help against whatever was making that sound, but because it gave me something to hold on to. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed almost instantly by the density of the forest. "This is a National Forest Ranger. Identify yourself." The breathing stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound itself because it meant something was listening. Something had processed my words and made a decision about them. I turned off my headlamp. In the complete darkness, my eyes began to adjust almost immediately, picking up the faint ambient light from the stars filtering through the trees. The November moon was nearly full, and it provided enough light to see the rough shapes of the forest around me. I stood absolutely still, listening. For the next 5 minutes there was nothing. Not a branch breaking, not a single sound. Just my own breathing and the distant, barely perceptible noise of the wind moving through the upper canopy. Then I heard it again, not the wet breathing, but something else. Footsteps, human footsteps, moving with an odd gait from somewhere up the slope, toward the west. The person, and I was certain it was a person, the cadence was all wrong for an animal, was walking directly toward my position but seemed oblivious to my presence. My hand tightened on the bear spray canister. "Trail is closed after dark," I called out again. "You need to come down from the ridge and use the main path." The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, nothing. Then they resumed, but now they were moving in a wide arc around me. Not directly toward me, but definitely aware of my location. I turned my headlamp back on and swung it in the direction of the movement. The beam caught nothing but trees and the pale undergrowth of late autumn. The footsteps stopped instantly. "I'm armed," I lied. "I have a radio and backup is 5 minutes away." Both were false statements. I had the bear spray and a knife. My radio wouldn't reach anyone until I hiked back to higher ground, a process that would take 30 minutes at minimum. Backup didn't exist on a Tuesday night in November. A sound came then that has haunted every quiet moment since that night. It was almost like laughter, but it emerged from multiple points in the surrounding forest simultaneously. a sound that had a quality of distortion, as if it were being played backward or filtered through something that shouldn't allow human vocal cords to produce it. The laughter, if it was laughter, had no joy in it. It had the flat, observational quality of a predator studying prey. I moved, not toward the sound but downslope, moving with speed that made my boots slip on the loose stone and leaf litter. Behind me I heard the footsteps resume, no longer bothering with the pretense of avoiding me. They were faster now, and the breathing sound returned, that wet, drowning quality that seemed to accelerate as the distance between us decreased. I was running now, my headlamp bouncing wildly in my grip, creating a strobe effect that disoriented me more than it helped. My shoulder hit a tree I didn't see, and pain shot through my collarbone. I kept moving. The breathing was closer now, so much closer that I could hear individual breaths, each one more labored than the last, as if whatever was behind me was excited by the chase. I risked a look over my shoulder and saw, for just a fraction of a second, a shape, tall, bipedal, but the proportions were wrong. The limbs seemed too long, and the way it moved was jerky, as if the person wearing that body wasn't quite familiar with how to operate it correctly. I made it to the main trail and the ground suddenly became more even. I was still running, still hearing the breathing behind me, still sensing that presence matching my pace. My chest was screaming, and my legs felt like they were filled with liquid fire, but I kept running. The trail widened, and suddenly I could see the ranger station ahead, its lights blazing in the darkness like a refuge from hell itself. I crashed through the door without stopping, and for the first time since the breathing started, I heard it stop. The silence was absolute. I stood inside the station, gasping for breath, my hands shaking so violently I could barely lock the door behind me. I stood at the window for the next 40 minutes watching the tree line. Nothing emerged, no shape, no movement, no sound. Whatever had been pursuing me had stopped at the lights. That was 6 months ago, and I'm still trying to convince myself it was a person. A disturbed human being who had wandered into the mountains and wanted to frighten me. The logical part of my brain insists on this explanation, because the alternative requires accepting that something else was moving through those mountains that night. Something that wore the shape of a person the way you might wear a suit. But I know what I heard. And more importantly, I know what I know about the Appalachians, the stories my mother told me when I was young, the legends that have survived in these mountains for longer than anyone can properly trace. She warned me, when I was 7 years old, that some things that walk on two legs are not people anymore. Some things learned how to move like us, how to sound like us, almost. The almost is where the danger lives. The breathing sound has returned 3 times since that November night, though always at a distance. Always in the deep woods, always when I'm alone, always in the hours just before dawn. I still work as a ranger in these mountains, but now, when I'm doing perimeter checks, I bring others with me, and I avoid the ridge near Klingman's Dome entirely. Sometimes, late at night in my cabin, I wonder if it's still out there, watching the lights from just beyond the perimeter of safety, learning more perfectly how to be human, waiting for one of us to be foolish enough to venture out alone. By March, I had almost convinced myself that the November incident was a product of my own mind. The power of suggestion is strong, especially when you spend most of your time alone in the wilderness. I'd been reading too many of the old stories, my mother's cautionary tales that I'd half dismissed in childhood. The rational adult mind has remarkable capacity for rewriting terrifying experiences into something more digestible. That rationality died on a morning when I found the deer. I was on a routine trail patrol, maybe 4 miles from the ranger station, when I encountered it in a clearing just off the main path. It was a young buck, maybe 2 years old, and it was standing absolutely still in the center of the clearing. This in itself was unusual. Deer typically flee at the approach of a human, especially in a direct line of sight with no escape route blocked by terrain. This one didn't move. As I approached, cautiously, because there's always a possibility of disease in a deer that doesn't react normally, I began to understand why it wasn't moving. The back of its skull had been crushed. The entire rear section of its head was caved in, still partially matted with blood, but old blood. This had happened at least several days ago, maybe longer. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the injury. It was the fact that the deer had apparently been standing in that exact spot the entire time, even as its corpse began to decompose. There were no drag marks, no evidence of struggle. It simply stood there, dead on its feet, held upright by some mechanism I couldn't comprehend. When I moved closer and reached out to touch its shoulder, the entire corpse collapsed immediately, as if the strings holding it upright had been cut. It fell heavily, and flies erupted from the opening in the skull in a dark cloud. I spent the next hour searching the surrounding area for any indication of what could have done this. A large predator, perhaps? We had mountain lions in the range, though encounters were rare. But a mountain lion wouldn't have left the body standing. They didn't possess the dexterity or the interest in arranging kills like this. The thought came to me, unbidden and unwelcome. Something had positioned the body here. Something with hands and with an intention to place it precisely in this location. The killing itself might have been opportunistic, but the arrangement was deliberate. I marked the location on my GPS and continued my patrol, my earlier rationality now deeply fractured. That night I made a decision I'd been avoiding. I called Sarah. Sarah Takoa had been my partner for 3 years before things fell apart. She was a wildlife biologist and one of the few people who knew the Appalachian legends as thoroughly as I did. More importantly, she believed them. Not in the way you believe in folklore or interesting stories, but in the way you believe in things you've been convinced of by evidence. She'd spent 2 years studying unusual predation patterns in the range, and some of her findings had pointed toward predator behavior that didn't match known species. We'd ended things because she wanted to move back to civilization, and I couldn't. Looking back, I think she also couldn't accept that the things she was observing in the mountains pointed toward conclusions that modern wildlife biology wasn't equipped to handle. Dakota? Her voice, when she answered, carried surprise. It had been 8 months since we'd last spoken. I need to talk to you about something, I said. Something about the patterns you were researching. There was a long pause. What kind of patterns? Predation, behavior that doesn't match known species, and something else. A kill I found today that was positioned deliberately. Another pause, longer this time. I could hear her breathing, the same healthy breathing of a living person that was 1,000 times more reassuring than the sound I'd heard in November. I'm coming up there, she said. Don't go out alone. She arrived 2 days later, driving her ancient Land Cruiser up the mountain in a rainstorm that turned the world into a study in grays and obscured visibility to almost nothing. We met at the ranger station, and seeing her was like seeing a piece of my own sanity walk through the door. Sarah was lean and weathered in the way of people who spend significant time outdoors. Her hair, which had been long when we were together, was now cut short, practical. She was carrying a worn leather notebook and a look of grim recognition. Tell me, she said, without preamble. I told her about November. I told her about the breathing sound, the footsteps, the wrong proportions of the shape I'd glimpsed. I told her about the deer. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she opened her notebook and showed me photographs. They were of carcasses, mostly deer and elk, but also a few black bears. Many of them showed injuries consistent with the buck I'd found, but others showed something worse, a kind of systematic dissection, as if something with hands had carefully opened the animals to examine their interior structures. I documented 73 unusual kills in this range over 18 months, she said. And that was only the ones I found. There could be dozens more that I missed. What kills them? I asked. I don't know, Sarah said. That's the honest answer. The injuries are sometimes consistent with large predator kills. Claw marks, crushing force, but the behavior afterward is completely wrong. The arrangement, the positioning, sometimes the partial consumption that seems to be sampling rather than feeding. And then there are the kills that don't match any predation pattern I can identify. We drove to the location where I'd found the deer. The rain had stopped by the afternoon, leaving everything waterlogged and dripping. The clearing was easy to find. Sarah had marked several similar sites herself during her research. The buck was mostly skeleton now, the soft tissue having been consumed or decomposed. Sarah knelt beside it and examined the skull carefully. This fracture pattern, she said. I've seen this before, but only on larger animals, and never on animals this young and small. What does it indicate? I asked. Either enormous strength applied with precision, or, she trailed off. Or what? Or something that's learning how to hunt. Something that's trying different methods, seeing what works, what doesn't. The implication hung between us like a physical thing. We heard the sound that night. We'd set up camp in the ranger station, and I'd recommended we do a perimeter walk just after dusk, while we still had some ambient light. Sarah had agreed, more to confirm the location with her own senses than anything else. We were about 2 miles out on the trail when we heard it, the wet, labored breathing that had plagued my nightmares for months. But hearing it with Sarah present was different. It made it real in a way that my solo experience hadn't quite solidified. "Do you hear that?" I asked, even though I knew the answer. "Yes," Sarah whispered. "It's coming from the northeast ridge, maybe half a mile out." We stood absolutely still. The breathing continued, a steady in and out, like something with lungs that weren't quite shaped correctly. And then, something new. I heard my own voice. "Please don't shoot," it said, from the direction of the breathing. "I'm lost. I've been lost for 3 days." The voice was perfect. Not just the words, but the inflection, the slight rasp in my throat from the exhaustion I sometimes felt at the end of a long patrol. It was absolutely, unmistakably my voice. "That's not possible," Sarah breathed beside me. "No," I agreed. "It's not. I'm scared," my voice continued, and the words were so perfectly calibrated to create an emotional response. They used phrases I'd said, inflections I used when I was frightened. "Please help me. I'm so cold." Sarah's hand found mine. Her grip was tight, almost painful. "Come on," I said, not to the voice but to Sarah. We walk back. Slowly. "Don't run." "Dakota, wait," the voice called. My voice, absolutely mimicking the way I would call someone's name if I were desperate, if I were hurt. "Don't leave me out here." We walked. Not slowly, despite my instruction. We moved at a pace that was just short of running, staying on the trail, keeping our direction toward the ranger station. Behind us, the breathing continued, but it wasn't moving. It stayed at approximately the same distance, neither pursuing nor receding. Then I heard Sarah's voice. "He's going to hurt me," it said, in Sarah's exact tone, carrying all of her specific patterns of speech and cadence. "Dakota, help me, please." I wanted to cover my ears. I wanted to stop and run toward the sound. I wanted to deny what I was hearing, but I kept walking, kept my grip on Sarah's hand, and didn't look back. The voices continued all the way back to the ranger station, both of ours, sometimes speaking simultaneously, sometimes alternating, sometimes having entire conversations that used our words and our patterns but said things neither of us would say. They begged, they threatened, they described things that would happen to us if we stayed out too long. They knew details only we would know, events from our relationship that only I could have shared with Sarah. When we got back to the station and locked the doors, the voices stopped immediately. The silence was absolute, and in that silence, I felt something shift in my understanding of reality. Whatever was out there in the mountains had spent months, perhaps longer, observing us. Not just my voice, but enough of me to perfectly replicate how I spoke, how I moved, how I thought. And it had learned Sarah's patterns equally quickly. That night we didn't sleep. We sat in the ranger station with every light on, and Sarah pulled out her research with shaking hands. "It's learning," she said. "That's what the kill patterns show. The early ones are clumsy, almost experimental, but the more recent ones show increasing precision, and now it's learning how to mimic human behavior." "How is that possible?" I asked. "I don't know," Sarah said, "but I know we can't stay here, and we can't tell anyone. Who would believe us?" She was right. I knew she was right. If I reported this to the Park Service, they'd pull my credentials and recommend psychiatric evaluation. The rational world had no framework for what we were experiencing. "So what do we do?" I asked. "We learn its patterns," Sarah said. "We figure out what it's doing here, what it wants. Because if we're going to survive this, we need to understand what we're dealing with." But I already understood on some level. The old stories came back to me, my mother's warnings spoken in a voice I hadn't heard since I was 7 years old. The thing that wasn't a person anymore but learned to move like one. The thing that wanted what we had, our voices, our knowledge, our place in the world. The thing that was getting better at being human every single day. Sarah left on the 4th day, not out of cowardice, but out of necessity. She had to document what we'd experienced, had to preserve the information somewhere outside of our own terrified minds. She drove back to her research facility in Asheville and promised to return in a week with supplies and a plan. I was alone in the ranger station when I found the first message. It was carved into the wall of the back office, deep gouges in the wood that couldn't have been made quickly or quietly. The message was simple. Why did she leave? The handwriting was mine, not a perfect imitation but clearly intended to replicate my own hand. The letters were crude in some places, perfect in others, as if the thing doing the writing had looked at my signature many times and was practicing. This was new territory. It had moved into the station. That shouldn't have been possible. The doors were locked, the windows secure, but the carving in the wall was absolutely real. I could run my fingers along the cuts, feel the splinters of fresh wood. I called Sarah immediately. "It's getting bolder," she said, her voice tight with stress. Or something about having a second human present changed its behavior. Maybe it felt threatened, or maybe it was trying to decide if it could take both of us, I said. That's possible too, Sarah admitted. I'm still in Asheville. There's something I need to check in my research files. I think there's a pattern I missed. Give me 24 hours. I don't know if I have 24 hours, I said. Then don't sleep, Sarah said simply. If you feel threatened, go to the main ranger office. There are usually people there during business hours. Don't be alone with it. That night, I did exactly what Sarah suggested. I didn't sleep. I sat in the ranger station with every light on, a knife on the desk beside me, and I waited. Around 2 a.m. I heard it outside the window. Not the breathing this time, but singing. A low crooning melody that was almost lullaby-like, and the voice was mine, not my current voice, but my voice as it had been when I was younger, perhaps 15. I remembered that song. It was something my mother had taught me, something from the old stories. A warning song meant to remind young Cherokee of the things that hunted in the darkness. The thing was singing my own voice's rendition of a song designed to warn against things like itself. The horror of that, of the creature using my own spiritual protection against me, was almost more than I could process. I didn't respond. I sat silently listening to the song repeat over and over, watching the shadows around the exterior lights, waiting for some indication of movement. By dawn, the singing had stopped. I was hallucinating slightly from sleep deprivation, seeing movement in my peripheral vision that wasn't there when I turned my head directly. Sarah returned at 11 a.m. with a box of documents and a look of grim determination. I found it, she said, throwing the box on the table. Or at least, I found references to it. These are historical records from the 19th and 20th centuries, indigenous records, settler accounts, newspaper articles. They all describe the same thing, recurring across decades. We spent the next 6 hours going through the documents. What emerged was a pattern of killings, disappearances, and psychological disturbances that had plagued this particular section of the Appalachians for at least 200 years. It's always the same reports, Sarah explained, pointing to references across different documents. Something that learns human behavior, something that mimics speech, something that kills in specific, methodical ways. It shows up in one area. The attacks escalate over several months, and then it disappears. Disappears where? I asked. That's the part one can't determine. But here, she pointed to a gap in the timeline. It's been quiet for about 30 years. No reported incidents, no strange events, and now it's back. Why? I asked. Environmental pressure? Food source change? Human encroachment? Sarah shrugged. Or maybe it needed 30 years to fully understand how to be human, to refine its technique. The implication was clear. Whatever we were dealing with had spent 3 decades somewhere, perhaps deeper in the mountains, perhaps in a different range entirely, learning, evolving, becoming more perfect at its mimicry. I told Sarah about the message on the wall, about the singing with my own childhood voice. She listened, her expression becoming harder with each detail. It's focused on you, she said finally. It's studied you longer. You're its primary target. What do I do? You have to move, Sarah said. You can't stay in the ranger station, and you can't stay in these mountains. You have to get out and let someone else deal with this. I wanted to do exactly that. I wanted to pack a bag, get in my truck, and drive away from the Appalachians forever. But we both knew that wouldn't work. If it had learned me this thoroughly, if it could sing in my voice and write with my hand, then it would follow. The knowledge it had of me was tied to my presence. Leaving might just spread the problem. What if we lure it out? I said. If we can isolate it, corner it somewhere, we could at least observe it under controlled conditions. With what? Sarah asked. We don't have weapons that would work. We don't even know if it's biological enough for conventional violence to matter, and we'd need to understand its behavioral patterns first. But I was already thinking, already planning. I'd spent 17 years in these mountains. I knew the terrain like my own heartbeat, and I knew something about the hunting patterns that the old stories never fully explained. The thing that hunted us had to hunt, it needed to feed, and from the evidence Sarah had compiled, it needed to hunt regularly. It'll attack again, I said. It's shown a pattern of increasing boldness. It'll try to take one of us. Probably you, Sarah said grimly. So we set a trap, I said. We make ourselves available, but on our terms. We choose the location, we control the variables, and we document everything. Sarah stared at me like I'd suggested we fly to the moon. That's insane, she said. It's the only option that doesn't involve running or dying, I replied. We spent the rest of the day planning. The location would be the old fire tower on the eastern ridge. 3 miles from the main station, isolated, but with multiple approaches for observation. I would spend the night there alone, and Sarah would position herself at a distance with night vision equipment and a radio. If anything went wrong, she would alert the main ranger station and get actual help. It was a terrible plan, but it was the only plan we had. That night, I hiked to the fire tower. I reached the structure just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed somehow obscene given the circumstances. The tower was a skeletal thing, abandoned since the 1980s when automated fire detection systems had made human watchers obsolete. The stairs were rusted but still largely intact. I climbed to the observation platform at the top, about 60 feet above the ground, and settled in to wait. Sarah's voice came through the radio, tight and controlled. "I'm in position, checking your location, got visual confirmation. You're clear on approach routes for now." I sat in the darkness, my headlamp off, using the fading moonlight to see the surrounding forest. The temperature dropped as the night deepened, and I was grateful for the layers I'd worn. Around 2 a.m. it came. I didn't hear the breathing first. I heard the climbing, the sound of something ascending the tower, the metal groaning under weight. My heart rate spiked, and I keyed the radio. "It's here," I whispered. "It's climbing." The footsteps on the stairs were slow, methodical, obviously controlled. It was taking its time, perhaps testing each step, perhaps simply enjoying the approach of prey. I waited until the shape emerged from the darkness below the platform. It wore a human shape, tall, lanky, with proportions that were just barely inside the range of normal human variation. Its face was partially visible in the moonlight, and what I saw made my mind rebel against accepting it. The features were too smooth, the symmetry too perfect, like a sculptor's representation of the human face rather than an actual face. The eyes were there, but they held no warmth, no recognition, no spark of individual consciousness. They were observational organs, nothing more. It pulled itself up to the platform with movements that were precisely human in form but somehow fundamentally wrong in execution, as if each movement required deliberate thought rather than instinct. "You came," it said, in my own voice, using inflections I'd used 1,000 times. "I wondered if you would." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The fear had crystallized into something that was both paralyzing and clarifying. "I've been learning you," it continued. "Every word, every gesture. I can taste your fear right now. It's different from Sarah's fear. Older, more profound." Then suddenly it made a sound I hadn't heard before. A clicking, chittering noise that emanated from deep in its throat. And I realized, in that moment, that it was laughing. "I've decided something," it said. "I've decided that I don't need to kill you yet. I need to know you more completely. The sound of your voice isn't enough. I need to know what you think, what you feel. I need to understand why Sarah left, why she's coming back, what fear means to a creature that has learned to recognize danger without experiencing it." "What are you?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "I'm becoming," it said simply. "I'm becoming what you are. It's taking longer than I expected. There's more to being human than I initially understood. You're not just patterns and behaviors. You're something else, something that requires understanding." The thing took a step closer, and I realized with sudden clarity that I could fight. I could try, and that knowledge somehow gave me the courage to move. I struck without hesitation, pulling my knife from my boot and driving it forward with all the force I could muster. The knife connected with something that should have been flesh, but it felt like driving a blade into warm rubber. The thing didn't bleed. Instead, there was a sensation of tearing, of separation, as if my knife had managed to slice through something but not in the way it would slice through normal tissue. The thing made a sound that wasn't quite a scream, a noise that had a whistling, piercing quality that felt like it was trying to crawl inside my skull. It recoiled, and I didn't hesitate. I slashed again, and again, driving it backward across the platform. The headlamp came on simultaneously. Sarah had triggered it remotely, perhaps in response to the sound. The sudden illumination revealed something that will be burned into my mind until the day I die. The thing's surface was rippling. Where I'd cut it, the flesh, if you could call it that, was trying to close, to heal. But the process was visible and hideous. The wound in its arm was closing with a wet, muscular action, like watching an eye trying to close in reverse. It hissed, a sound that held more rage than I'd heard in anything alive. "You're harder than I expected," it said. "More capable of violence." Then it was gone. It didn't climb down the tower. It fell, releasing its grip and dropping, impacting the ground below with a sound that should have killed any creature that moved like a human. But there was no cry of pain, no sound of something broken. I stood on the platform, bleeding from where the creature's touch had torn my skin, breathing in great gasps, my knife still clenched in my hand. "Dakota," Sarah's voice crackled through the radio. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," I gasped. "It's gone. It left." By the time I climbed down from the tower, Sarah was already approaching through the forest, a rifle in her hands. Behind her came help. She'd called the ranger station while I was on the platform, had arranged for other rangers to approach from different directions, but the thing was already gone. We found no trace of it, no blood, no sign of which direction it had fled, only the knowledge that I'd wounded it, and the terrible certainty that it would heal. That was 3 months ago. I'm writing this account now because I need someone to know what's happening in these mountains, even if that someone is only a digital record, hidden away, waiting to be found by someone who might believe. The thing hasn't been seen since the night at the fire tower, but I know it's still here. I hear evidence of it everywhere. The killing patterns have changed. There are more of them now, more frequent, suggesting either that the creature is becoming more desperate or that there are multiple creatures, though Sarah's research suggests that's unlikely. What I know now that I didn't before is that the thing doesn't just observe, it doesn't just mimic, it's conducting an experiment of some kind. Each interaction seems designed to teach it something new about human behavior, human emotion, human response to threat. I've requested a transfer out of the mountains, but it was denied. Budget constraints, staffing shortages, the usual excuses. I could resign, but that would leave this section of the Appalachians with one less person who knows what's actually here, who understands the danger. Sarah stayed for 2 weeks after the fire tower incident, and then she left. She said it was to continue her research, to find historical records that might explain the creature's origin or its purpose. But I know the truth. She was terrified, and she couldn't function in that state. I don't blame her. The last thing she said to me before she left was this: "Whatever it wants from you, whatever it's trying to learn, don't let it finish. Because if it completes its understanding of how to be human, if it achieves that perfection, then nothing will be able to stop it." I think about that constantly now. The messages on the walls have continued. New ones appear every few weeks, carved in my handwriting, sometimes asking questions about my past, sometimes making statements about the person it's becoming. The latest one, discovered 2 days ago, simply read, "I almost understand. Last week I found a ranger who'd been missing for 3 days. When I found him, he was walking through the forest with perfect silence, perfect composure, following the trail with an efficiency that was almost mechanical. When I called his name, he turned toward me with a smile that was exactly right and exactly wrong. It didn't hurt," he said, in his own voice but with inflections that weren't his. The integration was surprisingly seamless. I ran. For the first time since November, I ran, and I'm still running internally, even as I sit here writing this. The official report states that Ranger Marcus Chen experienced a severe psychological episode and is currently receiving care at a psychiatric facility. No one is investigating the fire tower incident. No one is looking into the kill patterns. The mountains have claimed another person, and the world has explained it in rational, comforting terms. Tomorrow, I'm going to do something I've been avoiding. I'm going to go back to the mountains at night, and I'm going to listen for the breathing sound. When I find the creature, I'm going to have a conversation with it. Not to fight it, not to run from it, but to understand what it wants from me specifically. Because I've come to a terrible realization. If the creature is becoming human, learning human behavior, then it needs models. It needs teachers. And the more I interact with it, the more I provide it with data about human psychology, the more I'm accelerating its evolution. But it doesn't matter anymore. I think on some level, I've already been changed by it. Every night I'm aware of its presence, whether I hear it or not. Every silence carries the possibility of its breathing. Every familiar sound could be it, learning how to mimic the natural world. The fear has become such a constant part of my existence that I don't know if I remember what it felt like to live without it. Maybe that's what it wants. Not to kill us, but to change us. To take beings that once lived in ignorance of its existence and reshape us so completely that we become something new. Something caught between human and other. Something that understands what it means to be hunted from the inside. The wind is picking up outside my cabin. In a few minutes I'll hear something in that wind. It might be just the trees moving. It might be the creature practicing new sounds, new ways of existing in the world. Either way, I won't run anymore. I can't, because whatever is happening in these mountains, whatever transformation is occurring in the deep places where the Appalachian wilderness still holds its secrets, I'm part of it now, and I think perhaps the creature is part of something too. Something that was here before me, that will be here after me, that uses creatures like that thing, like creatures learning to be human as stepping stones toward its own becoming. That thought brings no comfort, but it brings understanding, and understanding in these mountains is sometimes all that keeps you alive. The scream came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I knew before I even pulled on my boots that something had gone terribly wrong in the Black Mountains. My name is Dakota. I've been a ranger for the National Forest Service in the Appalachian region for 14 years, covering nearly 300 square miles of dense woodland that swallows people whole. I've found bodies, I've searched for the missing, I've walked through bear territory alone in the dark and never felt as afraid as I did on that night. The emergency radio crackled again. Jessica, our dispatcher, her voice was tight, controlled, but underneath I could hear the tremor she was trying to suppress. Dakota, we have a possible 1054 on the Laurel Ridge Trail. Hikers heard screaming approximately 300 yards north of the Hellgate Overlook. Local police are en route, but they're looking at 30 minutes minimum. You're closest. 1054. That's the code for a dead body. But the screaming had come from a living person. I grabbed my pack and was in my truck before she finished talking. The roads were empty at that hour, just the sound of my tires on wet asphalt and the early autumn wind pushing through the valley. The forecast had called for frost. The radio kept hissing static between dispatch updates that told me nothing I wanted to hear. 2 hikers, male and female. They'd been camping at the overlook. The woman had run down the trail toward the visitor center alone. The man hadn't come down. I'd been driving these mountain roads since I was 23 years old. I knew every switchback, every dangerous curve, every place where the forest seemed to lean in too close to the pavement. But I'd never driven faster than I did that night. The overlook parking area was empty except for one vehicle, a blue sedan with out-of-state plates. New Jersey. The kind of car that didn't belong anywhere near these mountains. I pulled up beside it, killed my engine, and listened. Nothing. Just the wind and the sound of my own breathing. The forest beyond the gravel lot was absolute black. No moon. Just stars that looked very far away. The visitor center was dark. The bathrooms were locked. I could see the picnic area from the parking lot. The tables like pale ghosts in the gloom. No one there. The trailhead marker for Laurel Ridge was 50 yards down the paved path, and that's when I heard it. Not a scream, something worse. A voice. The woman's voice, I assumed, calling for help. But not from the trail ahead of me. From the forest to my left, at least 50 yards into the tree line, maybe more. Help, please, help me. The sentence cut off. Not like she'd been silenced. Like she'd stopped mid-word, deciding against finishing that thought. I switched on my flashlight and headed toward the sound, my radio already in my hand. Dispatch, I'm at the overlook. I can hear one victim in the forest, west of the trailhead, approximately 50 to 75 meters into the tree line. I'm moving to investigate. Copy that, Dakota. Police are 9 minutes out. Stay on the line. I stepped into the forest. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, showing me a narrow path through scrub brush and mountain laurel. The ground beneath my feet was soft with years of decomposing leaves. My legs brushed against thorny branches that pulled at my uniform. The smell was that same Appalachian smell I'd known all my life. Wet earth, rotting wood, the mineral scent of stone. Nothing alarming, just home. But something was wrong. The forest was too quiet. Not the normal quiet of 3 a.m. in the woods, the absence of sound. No insects, no wind rustling through the canopy, just my footsteps, the sound of my breathing, and the steady sweep of my flashlight. Hello? I called out. This is Ranger Dakota with the National Forest Service. Where are you? The response came immediately, a voice. The woman's voice, I was certain, coming from ahead and to the left. Help me. I'm down here, I'm hurt. I can't find the trail. The voice sounded close now, maybe 30 feet away. Frantic but coherent, scared but alive. I pushed through a dense cluster of rhododendron and suddenly the forest opened into a small ravine. My flashlight found her immediately. She was sitting on a boulder beside a narrow creek, Her left leg twisted beneath her at an angle that made my stomach turn. Her hiking clothes were torn. There was blood on her face. She looked up at me, and I could see relief flood through her. "Oh, thank God," she sobbed. "Thank God, you have to help him. There's something out here. There's something." "It's okay," I said, moving down toward her. "I'm right here. What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Chen. My husband, his name is David. He's further up the ravine. When we got lost, we went separate ways to find the trail, and he screamed. Just one scream and then nothing, and then I heard it. After the scream, I heard it. I reached her and knelt down to assess her leg. Definitely broken. Femur probably. That was a serious injury, a trauma that required an ER. But at least she was alive and conscious. "What did you hear?" I asked, already reaching for my radio. "Something that sounded like David," she said, and her voice dropped to barely a whisper. It was calling my name, saying my name over and over, but it wasn't David's voice. Not really. It sounded like David, but underneath the words there was something else, something wrong. A chill moved down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Dispatch, I have one victim here with a fractured femur. She needs immediate medical attention. Can you relay to the incoming units that—" The voice came from the ravine, from above us. "Sarah." I turned my flashlight toward the sound. The beam caught nothing but trees and shadow. But the voice came again, clearer this time. Unmistakably a man's voice. "Sarah, baby, I'm okay. I found the trail. Come up here." Sarah's entire body went rigid. Her hand gripped my arm hard enough to hurt. "That's not David," she whispered. "That's not his voice. That sounds like David, but—" "David?" I called out. "This is Ranger Dakota with the Forest Service. Are you injured?" Silence. Then Dakota, I need help. The lady ran. I don't know where she went. I fell. I think I've got a bad cut. Please, can you come up here?" The voice was different now. Not David's. This was the woman's voice, Sarah's voice, mimicking her own husband's cadence and words but filtered through her own vocal cords, speaking with her mouth. I felt Sarah's fingernails digging into my sleeve. "Run," she breathed. "We need to run. Right now." "We can't run," I said, but I was already making a decision, already moving. "Your leg." "I don't care. I'll crawl." "Dakota, please." It got David. I watched it happen. She pushed herself off the boulder with her hands, dragging herself toward the downslope of the ravine, away from the voice. I should have known better. 14 years as a ranger teaches you certain things about the mountains. The first rule is that the mountains don't follow the rules you think they do. But I still didn't move fast enough. The figure appeared at the top of the ravine so suddenly it seemed to materialize out of the darkness. I swung my flashlight toward it, and what I saw made my brain reject the image before it fully processed. It was David. It had to be. The shape was human. It wore David's hiking clothes, a gray Columbia jacket with a rip in the left sleeve. I could see the rip, but the way it moved, the way it descended the ravine, the angles were wrong, too fluid. Too wrong. And then my light caught its face. It was David, but David had never looked like this. The features were all there, the approximate shape of his face, but they were slightly out of alignment, stretched at the corners. The eyes caught the light like an animal's eyes, and when it opened its mouth to speak, I saw that the inside of its mouth was too dark, a darkness that seemed to extend beyond any normal depth. "Sarah left me," it said, but the voice wasn't David's anymore. Now it was mine. It was my voice, speaking with my mouth, my accent, my inflection. Sarah ran away, but Dakota stayed. It smiled. I don't remember making the decision to run. My body moved before my conscious mind caught up. I was moving down the ravine, moving towards Sarah, moving away from that thing. My flashlight bounced wildly, throwing shadows that seemed alive. Behind me it laughed, with my own laugh. The sound of myself enjoying something deeply, fundamentally wrong. We made it maybe 50 yards before I heard the sound change. No longer laughing, no longer using words, just a sound like something being torn open, like fabric ripping, like bone grinding against stone, a sound that no living thing should make. Sarah was ahead of me, dragging herself across the forest floor with her hands. Blood was streaming from her leg where she'd reopened the wound. I grabbed her under the arms and pulled, and together we scrambled up the far side of the ravine. The sound behind us didn't follow immediately. That terrified me more than if it had charged. The thing was confident. The thing knew there was nowhere for us to run. We broke through the tree line into the parking area. My truck was there. The visitor center was there. Civilization in some form was there. I half-carried, half-dragged Sarah across the gravel parking lot. She was screaming, but the screams were coming from somewhere deep inside her, as if she knew sound wouldn't matter anymore. I got her into the passenger seat of my truck and was reaching for the ignition when I heard it again. From inside the visitor center, behind the locked glass doors, a voice, Sarah's voice, speaking in the dark, quiet room. "Help me, Dakota. I'm in here. I'm scared. Please help me." And in the same instant, the radio on my hip crackled. "Ranger Dakota, this is dispatch. We're losing your signal. Are you okay? Police units are now 3 minutes out." That wasn't Jessica's voice. It was Jessica's voice, but underneath it was something layered, something that didn't belong. I didn't respond. I started the truck and drove. The hospital in Asheville is 45 minutes from the overlook on normal roads. I did it in 32 minutes. Sarah was unconscious by the time we arrived, blood loss and shock taking their toll. The ER staff swarmed over her immediately. Broken femur, lacerations, severe dehydration, early signs of sepsis from the exposed wound. She would survive, but she wouldn't talk for 3 days, and when she finally did, she asked first if they'd found David. They hadn't. I gave my statement to the state police and the FBI. Both agencies listened with the kind of expressions that suggested they'd heard versions of this story before, even if they'd never heard of the thing that was actually responsible. "You're saying you didn't see the husband?" the lead FBI investigator asked. His name was Kowalski, mid-50s, career agent, the kind of man who'd seen enough of the world to be skeptical of anything that didn't have reasonable explanations. "I saw something," I said carefully. "Something that was wearing his appearance. But it wasn't David Chen." Kowalski didn't write that down. Instead, he watched me for a long moment. "In my experience, Ranger, people who are frightened and traumatized sometimes misinterpret what they see, especially in the dark. Especially when something genuinely traumatic is occurring. I know what I saw. A humanoid figure in David Chen's clothing behaving erratically, a thing that was mimicking human voices, multiple human voices, that could do things that..." I stopped, because there was no way to finish that sentence that wouldn't get me labeled as unreliable, as a possible suspect, as a man losing his grip on reality. The search for David Chen went on for 6 days. 50 rescue workers, 3 police dogs, helicopters. They found his backpack beside the creek in the ravine, his wallet, his watch, a single hiking boot, but not David, not anything recognizable as David. The official report described his disappearance as likely accidental, fall into a ravine, body washed down river, search and rescue suspended when the river ran too high and too cold to search further. It was reasonable, it made sense. It fit the facts that the investigators had chosen to acknowledge. But I knew the truth. The thing I saw, the thing that happened in the Black Mountains, that was only the beginning. For the first week, nothing happened. I stayed home on paid leave while the state completed its investigation. Sarah's husband was dead. That much was certain. The police interviewed me 14 times. They looked at my background, my service record, my history. I passed the polygraph. They'd run out of things to suspect me of by day 5. I watched the news. The story ran for 3 days on the local stations. "Hiker missing in National Forest." The headlines read, "Search and rescue suspended." There was a photo of David Chen. He looked happy in it. He was smiling. On the 8th day, I got a call from Jessica at the dispatch center. "Dakota, we have a situation at the Hellgate Overlook Visitor Center. The cleaning staff found something this morning. The building was locked when they arrived. Everything was locked, but there was something inside." My stomach dropped. "What kind of something?" "You should see it in person. The state police are already there. They're requesting your presence for identification purposes." I drove back to the Overlook in daylight. Somehow that made it worse. The place that had been a nightmare of shadows and running and horror was now just a tourist destination. A picnic area, a parking lot, a small brick building with a flagpole out front. But inside there was a message. It covered the entire wall of the main room. The words were written in something red and dark, something that didn't wash off easily even when the maintenance crew tried, something that had soaked into the plaster. "Dakota, your voice is next. Then your face. Then your name will be forgotten." The letters were crude but deliberate, written large, written with intent. The police had photographs. They had samples. They had theories about whether this was the work of a mentally disturbed person or a genuine threat. They asked if I had enemies, if someone might have a grudge against me. I thought about the voice in the darkness. speaking with my inflection, speaking with my words, speaking from a mouth that was shaped like a face I'd seen in a mirror that morning. "This is a credible threat," I told them. "I need to take it seriously." The response from the authorities was measured. Increased patrols, a recommendation that I not work alone, suggestions that I consider time off. But there was nothing in any manual that addressed what I actually knew was happening. The thing in the mountains didn't follow human rules, didn't follow the rules of law or reason or investigation. It had tasted human voices, and it wanted more. It had learned to mimic, to trick, to separate prey from protection, and it had marked me as next. 3 weeks passed. Nothing happened. That was the worst part, the waiting. Every shift in the forest felt like walking into a closed room where something was already waiting in the dark. Every sound could be it. Every voice on the radio could be something wearing a familiar shape underneath. I was the only one who knew the truth. Sarah was still in the hospital. She'd been moved to a psychiatric ward after her initial recovery began. She wasn't talking about what happened in the ravine. When I visited her, she would just stare at me from her hospital bed, and I could see in her eyes that she knew things, the same things I knew. The understanding of what was actually hunting in those mountains. I requested a transfer to a desk job. They told me I was one of the best rangers they had. That time would heal things. That what I'd witnessed was understandably traumatic. I didn't argue. Instead, I started researching. The Appalachian Mountains are old. The oldest mountains on the continent, worn down by millions of years of erosion, and for thousands of years before that they were inhabited by Cherokee and Shawnee and other nations, all of whom had stories. Stories that the European settlers had tried to erase, but the mountains remember. Skinwalker. That's what the Southwest tribes called them. But the Cherokee had their own version. Voices in the dark. Things that learned how to sound like you. Things that hunted at the edges of civilization, in the places where the forest was thick enough to hide anything. I read accounts from the 1800s. A hiker who'd encountered his own voice in the Smokies. A family that had heard their names called in the dark over and over until they fled into the towns and never came back to the mountains. The stories were consistent. The thing learned voices. The thing mimicked. The thing took something from you when it did. I started carrying a gun. A Sig Sauer P226 in a shoulder holster under my ranger uniform. Institutional policy discouraged it, but I didn't care about institutional policy anymore. On a Tuesday, 4 weeks after David Chen disappeared, I got a report of an injured hiker on Raven's Crest Trail. A ranger from a neighboring district had responded. When he didn't check in after 2 hours, I was sent to find him. The trail was a well-maintained hiking route that climbed about 400 feet in elevation gain over 2 miles. It was a popular spot. There should have been other hikers. There weren't. Just Ranger Matthew Chen. No relation to David, but the coincidence sat heavy on my shoulders. I found him at the summit, sitting beside the trail marker. At first I thought he was unconscious. Then I realized he wasn't breathing. His body was still warm, his eyes were open and focused on nothing. There were no marks on him, no blood, no signs of trauma. But something about his expression, there was a piece to it that felt wrong. Like he'd seen something so complete, so utterly comprehensible, that all the tension had drained out of his face. My radio was already in my hand when he moved. His head turned toward me with a sound like grinding stone. "Dakota," he said. And it was my voice, my exact voice, with every inflection I'd ever used. "I'm so glad you came. I've been waiting for you." The body of Matthew Chen stood up. It moved wrong. The joints bent at angles that human joints don't achieve. It smiled with a mouth that was beginning to show cracks, as if the face underneath was something too large to fit inside the skin. I backed away and pulled the gun. "Stay where you are," I said. "You can't kill me with that," it said in my voice, my words. "The gun won't help. But I appreciate you bringing it. It's a nice sound, very sharp. I want to hear it. I want to remember how it sounds when you fire it." I was moving backward down the trail, keeping the gun trained on the thing wearing Matthew Chen's body. "Dakota," it said, and now it switched voices. Now it was Matthew's voice, real Matthew Chen's voice, full of pain and consciousness and desperation. "Dakota, please, I'm still in here. I can feel it learning me. It's inside." Then it cut off, and the thing laughed. With Matthew's laugh, mixed with something beneath it, something like wind through a cave. I fired. The shot hit its center mass. The thing didn't fall. It didn't even react to the wound. Instead, it took a step toward me, and I could see the blood beginning to pour from the hole in Matthew Chen's chest, soaking the ranger uniform, pooling at his feet. But it kept walking. I fired 3 more times. All center mass, all direct hits. The thing just kept coming, and I could see now that the face was separating from the skull underneath, that the shape of it was beginning to fragment, to reveal something else entirely. Something that had too many eyes, too many angles, proportions that hurt to look at. I turned and ran. Behind me I heard my own voice calling my name, saying it over and over. But underneath the words I could hear that other sound, that grinding, tearing, impossible sound. The sound of something that had worn too many faces and was starting to show through the cracks. The investigation into Matthew Chen's death was complicated by the fact that I'd shot a dead body. The ballistics team, the FBI, the state police, they all had questions. The official story was that Chen had already been deceased when I found him, that I'd panicked, that I'd fired at the body, that trauma was making my memory unreliable. They tested for drugs in my system. They ran psychiatric evaluations. They found nothing wrong, but they suspended my badge anyway, pending investigation, pending resolution, pending the moment when the authorities could figure out what had actually happened. I knew what had actually happened. The thing had used Matthew as bait. It had learned enough to speak with his voice, to mock me with my own voice, to show me that no firearm, no weapon, no tool of human civilization could touch it. And now I was waiting for the next time it came. I moved out of my cabin in the valley. I bought a place in Asheville, a townhouse with good locks and good sightlines. I kept the gun with me always. I stopped working. I stopped leaving the house at night. But mostly, I listened, because the thing had found another way to reach me. It started with wrong numbers. My phone would ring at 3 a.m. I'd answer and hear breathing, my breathing. Then it would speak. "I'm getting better," it would say in my voice. "I can hold your voice longer now. Soon I'll be able to use it perfectly. Would you like to hear me practice?" Then I'd hear conversations, two of me, having entire dialogues in my voice, discussing things I'd never said, making plans that weren't my plans. The phone company said there was nothing unusual on the lines. The FBI said it was possible I was experiencing psychological breaks. My therapist suggested that unprocessed trauma sometimes manifests as auditory hallucinations, but I knew the truth. It was learning me. 3 months after Matthew Chen's body was found, Sarah asked to speak with me. The psychiatric facility she was in allowed 1 visitor per week. I drove to see her every Wednesday. She looked better than she had. Some color had returned to her face, but her eyes were the same. Aware, haunted, understanding. "It's talking to me," she said without preamble. "In my room, at night. It speaks with David's voice, but underneath I can hear it learning. It's trying to understand what it took from him. It wants to know how to think like him, how to feel like him." I didn't know what to say. "It told me something," she continued. "It said that in another month or 2 it'll have learned enough of David to go into town, to go to his parents' house, to talk to them. They'll let him in because he'll sound like David. He'll move like David. And then," she didn't finish. She didn't have to. "It's spreading," I said. "Yes," she said. "That's what terrifies me most. It's not hunting just for food or sport. It's hunting to learn. Every voice it takes, every face it wears, it understands more about how to be human, how to trick us, how to move among us." That night, I researched Sarah's statement in the official record. The police report said she'd been incoherent, that her account of events was unreliable due to trauma and shock, but her account had been more accurate than any observation any official had made. The thing in the mountains was evolving. On a cold October evening, 6 months after David Chen disappeared, I drove back to the Black Mountains. I told myself I was going to end this, that I would go to the place where it lived and kill it. I brought the gun. I brought a knife. I brought a rifle and ammunition and supplies for staying in the forest overnight. I was a fool. The Laurel Ridge Trail was empty. The overlook was empty. I hiked into the ravine where Sarah had found me with her broken leg, where the thing had first shown itself in its incomplete form, wearing David Chen like an ill-fitting suit. The creek was running low. Winter was approaching. The trees were bare, skeletal, revealing the structure of the forest beneath. I found his grave 50 yards up the ravine from where we'd encountered the thing. David Chen was buried in a shallow grave, his body arranged with his hands folded across his chest. The thing had been careful, respectful in a way. He was decomposed enough that identification would be difficult, but from the size and build, it was him. There was no sign of trauma, no wounds, no marks of violence. It had simply absorbed him, learned from him, and left what was left behind. I was standing over the body when it came, not from behind, from in front, walking down the trail like a hiker, It was wearing a human face that I didn't recognize. A face it had constructed from pieces of all the people it had taken. The mouth was too wide. The eyes were separated by too much distance, but it moved smoothly. It had learned. "You came back," it said in my voice. "I came to kill you," I said. "With what?" it asked. "The gun? Bullets don't work on me. I showed you that." It was right, I'd already proven that. But I was holding the gun anyway because holding it made me feel like I still had power, like I still had agency. "What do you want?" I asked. "Everything," it said. "I want every voice, every face, every way of being. I want to become so completely human that even you couldn't tell the difference. And then I'll move into the towns. I'll live in your houses. I'll sleep in your beds. I'll speak your languages and think your thoughts. And I'll never need to hunt again because I'll be one of you." "People will notice," I said. "Will they?" it asked. And it smiled with a mouth that belonged to too many faces at once. "How many missing hikers do you think there are in these mountains? How many people disappear and get written off as accident, as suicide, as simply never returning? The mountains are old, Dakota. They swallow people constantly, and I have all the time in the world to learn." I raised the gun and fired. The bullet caught it in the shoulder. It didn't flinch. It didn't bleed. Instead, where the bullet hit, the skin seemed to separate, and I could see something moving underneath, something that wasn't flesh or bone, something that looked like it was made of darkness and movement and hunger. I fired again. And again, until the gun was empty and the thing was still walking toward me. I dropped the gun and ran. Behind me I could hear it speaking, with my voice, with David's voice, with Sarah's voice, with Matthew Chen's voice, all of them layered together, all of them singing a song that had no words, no meaning except pure and absolute wrongness. I made it back to my truck. I don't remember the drive down the mountain. I remember gasoline. I remember going to the visitor center and pouring fuel through the broken window. I remember striking a match. The building caught fire quickly. The dry interior burned hot and fast. The flames reached 20 feet into the night sky. I sat in my truck and watched it burn, and I knew it wouldn't matter. Fire doesn't kill things like that. Nothing kills things like that. By the time the fire department arrived, I was already driving back toward town. The fire was ruled accidental. An old electrical system in an aging building, a common hazard in rural areas. They rebuilt the visitor center 2 years later. Better wiring, modern safety features, no problems. I was reinstated as a ranger after a 2-year evaluation period and a clean psychological assessment. I took a desk job, mostly paperwork, mostly staying inside where I could see the doors and windows. Sarah Chen was released from the psychiatric facility after 18 months. Her divorce was finalized shortly after. She moved to California. I saw her name in a newspaper once. She'd become an advocate for missing persons awareness in national parks. She was doing important work. I wonder if she sees the patterns that I see. The missing hikers that increase every year. The bodies that are found and don't seem to belong to anyone. The reports from rangers in other parks about voices in the dark. About creatures that imitate. The thing in the Black Mountains has stopped calling. But that's not because it's gone. It's because it doesn't need to call anymore. It's learning too quickly. It's spreading too far. Sometimes I get reports of strange incidents. A hiker in the Smokies who claims to have met himself on the trail. A park ranger in West Virginia who saw something impossible and wrote a report nobody believes. A woman in Kentucky who heard her husband's voice outside the house at 3 a.m., asking to be let in, speaking about things nobody else could know. The authorities don't connect these incidents. They file them under unreliable witnesses and trauma responses and misinterpretation. But I know better. It's getting good at being us. Every year it learns more. Every voice it takes, it understands us better. And eventually it won't need to hunt anymore because it will have learned how to simply exist among us. Invisible, indistinguishable, complete. Sometimes I sit in my office and listen to the radio chatter from rangers in the field. I listen for signs, for voices that sound almost right but not quite. For the slight hesitation that suggests something is still learning how to be human. And I wait for the day when I won't be able to tell the difference anymore. When I won't know if the person I'm talking to is real, or if there's something wearing a human shape like a borrowed coat. That's the real horror of what hunts in the Appalachian Mountains. It's not what it can do to our bodies. It's what it can become. And once it becomes perfect, once it learns to be us completely, there's no killing it. Because it will already be everywhere, already be everyone, just waiting in the dark, speaking with voices we recognize, wearing faces we trust, until the moment it decides to stop pretending. That moment is coming, and I'm the only one who knows. I was 6 miles into the Klingman's Dome Trail when the light started dying wrong, not sunset wrong, that I could handle. I've walked these ridges in the dark more times than I can count. My name is Dakota Reeves, 28 years old, park ranger for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for the past 5 years. I know these mountains like most people know their own home. I know which trails flood in spring, which rock faces crumble in winter, which sections of fence need mending. I know the sounds, the rhythm of this place. This wasn't that. The afternoon had been normal. A hiker reported an injured deer on the Upper Ridge Trail near Klingman's Dome, the highest peak in Tennessee. I'd radioed dispatch at 3 p.m., said I was heading up to locate it, assess the injury, and call for veterinary support if needed. Dispatch logged it. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual except that it was already late in the season to find deer that far up in that condition. But animals get desperate. Wounds go septic. Survival makes them do unpredictable things. I should have known something was different. The closer I got to the location, the quieter the forest became. Not gradually, all at once. Around mile 4, the ambient sound just cut off. No birds, no insects, no rustle of small animals in the brush. Just my breathing and the soft crush of my boots on the trail. I remember stopping, listening, thinking maybe a predator was close and had spooked everything. Black bears don't hunt often, but it happens. Mountain lions are supposed to be extinct here, but I've seen scat I can't explain. Paw prints too large. I kept walking. By mile 5, I knew something was wrong. The forest wasn't just quiet. It felt watched. Not hunted, watched. There's a difference. When an animal tracks you with predatory intent, you feel the violence in it. This was different. This was observation, deliberate, concentrated. The way you feel when someone stands behind you in an empty building and you suddenly know you're not alone. I stopped and looked behind me. The trail was empty. Dense rhododendron thickets on both sides. The trail itself maybe 6 feet wide at that point. I could see maybe 30 feet back before the shadows and vegetation swallowed the path. Nothing moved. Nothing made sound. "Hello?" I called out. Standard procedure if there's a hiker in distress or if I'm approaching someone I don't want to startle. Nothing answered. I turned back around and kept moving. My hand rested on the bear spray attached to my belt, not out of necessity but out of habit. The weight of it was comforting. The radio on my shoulder was on low volume, tuned to dispatch. I could reach it if I needed to report anything. Everything was fine. Everything was under control. That's what I told myself. The injured deer location was supposed to be just before the summit, where the trail opens up slightly and the view toward Newfound Gap becomes visible. I'd been up here enough times that I could navigate it half blind, but as I climbed the light changed. The sun was still above the horizon, probably an hour of daylight left, but the shadows under the trees were getting darker faster than they should. The canopy isn't dense here. We're near the summit. The trees are shorter, wind-swept. Sunlight should have been abundant. It wasn't. The shadows had taken on a weight. They didn't just cover the ground. They seemed to fill the air. I could see my breath, even though it was September and still warm. My body temperature dropped. I felt it in my chest first, then spreading down my spine. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up, not metaphorically. I could feel each follicle rigid against my skin. I kept walking because stopping felt worse. At 6 miles, I broke through the trees to the summit area. The wind hit me immediately, sharp and cold, carrying the smell of wet stone and altitude. The view opened up, the blue-gray ridges of the Appalachians stretching away in every direction, hazy in the distance, beautiful in that way that makes you feel small. The deer was there. It was standing in the middle of a boulder field, about 40 yards from the tree line where I'd emerged. My first thought was relief. At least the report wasn't a false alarm. My second thought was confusion. The deer wasn't injured. It was standing perfectly still, facing away from me, toward the west where the light was draining fastest. It was a white-tailed doe, medium-sized, completely motionless, not grazing, not drinking from the runoff streams, just standing, waiting. I approached slowly, hand already reaching for my radio to call dispatch. As I got closer, I could see why the hiker might have reported it as injured. Its back legs were trembling. Not from cold or pain, from something else. The kind of trembling you get from raw, overwhelming fear. I've seen that tremor in animals before, right before they break and run. Easy, girl, I said softly, keeping my voice low and calm. I'm not going to hurt you. The doe's ears twitched. It heard me, but it didn't run. It didn't turn to look at me. It just kept staring out toward the western ridges, body vibrating. I got to within 10 feet of it. Now I could see the problem. Its breathing was wrong. Too fast, too shallow, hyperventilation. The deer was in acute stress, bordering on panic. I'd seen this before in animals caught in traps or cornered by predators. The fight-or-flight response cranked up so high that the animal's own physiology was becoming a threat. Heart rate so elevated it could cause cardioversion. Breathing so fast it would lead to metabolic alkalosis. Something had terrified this deer beyond rationality. As I watched, it turned its head slightly. Not to look at me, to look at something else. Its eye rolled back, showing white, and it stared at the boulders to its left. Bare gray stone, no cover, no reason for anything to be hiding there, but the deer's entire focus was locked on that spot. I turned to follow its gaze. For a moment, I saw nothing, just gray rock and shadow. Then my eyes caught something. A shape at the edge of my vision, maybe 30 yards away, partially obscured by a large boulder outcropping. It was the wrong color for this landscape. Too dark, too defined, too tall. I couldn't make out what it was. My brain refused to process the proportions. It looked like a person standing upright, but wrong somehow. The angle of the limbs, the set of the shoulders, like someone had learned to imitate human posture but had gotten the details slightly off. The kind of wrongness that makes you feel cold in your stomach. I blinked. When I opened my eyes, it was gone. There was only rock and gathering darkness. Okay, I said out loud, feeling my heart start to accelerate. Okay, I turned back to the deer. It was still trembling, still staring at where the shape had been. I reached slowly for my radio, my eyes never leaving the boulder field. Dispatch, this is Ranger Reeves at Klingman's Dome Summit. I'm at the reported location. I see the injured animal. I'm going to need some backup and possibly a veterinary unit. Static answered me. Then dispatch came back, but the reception was fragmentary. Affirmative, Reeves. Check, your signal is breaking up. I moved away from the deer, back toward the tree line, hoping to get better reception. The signal was degraded. That happens sometimes at this elevation, but it was definitely weaker than it should have been. I tried again. Dispatch, can you copy? I'm at Klingman Summit. Code yellow on the animal. Need backup and vet support. More static. This time I caught, copy that, Dakota, high wind warning, condition degree. Then the signal died completely. I checked my radio, full battery. The dial was set correctly. The antenna was clear. But I was getting nothing but white noise now. Shit, I muttered. That's when I heard the sound. It came from the boulders to my left, the same area where the shape had been. A sound like fabric tearing, but organic, wet. The kind of sound you'd make if you dragged something alive across rough stone. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, then stopped. The deer bolted. It didn't run toward me or toward the tree line. It ran straight up the slope, bounding across the rocks with desperate, uncoordinated jumps. I watched it go, thinking I should probably let it run, that whatever it was fleeing from was faster and more dangerous than anything I could help with by staying. Then I heard it again. This time it was directly behind me. I spun around, my hand instinctively going for the bear spray. There was nothing there, just empty boulder field and the growing darkness. But I heard it clearly now, not the tearing sound, but something else. Breathing. Heavy, rhythmic breathing, coming from somewhere in the rocks to my left, maybe 20 yards away. The breathing of something large. I started backing toward the tree line. Slow steps, controlled, never taking my eyes off the area where the sound was coming from. This was wrong. Everything about this was deeply, fundamentally wrong. My training was screaming at me to get off this summit, to get back into the tree cover where I could move faster. The breathing got louder. It wasn't getting closer. The distance seemed constant, but it was getting deeper, more aggressive. I could hear the air moving in and out, heavy and wet. I could smell it now too, rank like a predator's den, old blood and rot. I'm a ranger, I called out, my voice not sounding like mine. I'm armed. I'm calling for backup. The breathing stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I could feel sweat running down the back of my neck despite the cold. I was maybe 30 feet from the tree line now. If I ran, I could make it. If I ran and whatever this was came after me, the dense forest might slow it down enough for me to reach better cell coverage or the main hiking trail. But if I ran, it would hunt me. I could feel that truth in the same way I'd felt being watched on the trail. This thing, whatever it was, wanted me to run. The knowledge was absolute. Some part of my brain that had been human for 2 million years understood this. This was a predator, and predators hunt fleeing prey. So I stood still. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Time gets strange when your body is locked in primal fear. My hands were shaking. My breathing was as shallow and fast as the deer's had been. I was one bad decision away from my own nervous system killing me. Then I heard the footstep. It wasn't human. The sound was wrong, too heavy, weight distributed incorrectly. But it was definitely a footstep, one foot hitting stone, then another, moving parallel to me, along the edge of the boulder field, staying in the rocks. I ran. I don't remember making the decision to run. My body did it without consulting my brain. I sprinted for the tree line, my legs pumping, my breath tearing out of my throat. I could hear it coming now, crashing through the boulders behind me, no longer trying to move quietly. The footfalls were getting closer. I hit the tree cover and kept going, crashing down the trail without regard for my footing. Branches whipped at my face, drawing blood. Rocks rolled under my boots. I was moving too fast, completely off balance, but the thought of stopping was worse than the risk of falling. The thing behind me never slowed down. I could hear it pushing through the vegetation, moving faster than anything that large should be able to move through thick forest. My mind was giving me images, something wrong, something that shouldn't exist. I forced myself not to look back. Looking back meant it was real. Looking back meant I had to accept what I was running from. I ran for what felt like miles but was probably much less. My lungs were burning. My muscles were screaming. I was losing coherence, losing the ability to navigate. Eventually, I just let gravity and momentum carry me down the mountain in a kind of controlled fall. I must have fallen, because suddenly I was on the ground, the wind knocked out of me. I lay there for several seconds, gasping, unable to move, listening. The sound of pursuit had stopped. I didn't know how far I'd run or how long. It was fully dark now, the kind of dark you only get in the mountains when clouds roll in and kill the stars. I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. I couldn't tell if I was still on the trail or if I'd crashed through the forest entirely. I got to my feet slowly, my legs barely supporting my weight. My radio was still on my belt, still useless. I tried it again anyway. Dispatch? Is anyone there? I need help. I'm somewhere on the descent from Klingman's Dome. There's something in the woods. Something that shouldn't be here. Static answered. That's when I realized I could see something in the darkness. Not clearly, not with details, but a general outline. Something large, standing maybe 15 yards away, watching me from the edge of the forest. It was keeping distance, not advancing. Hunting. It was still hunting. It was just doing it smart now. It knew I was exhausted. It knew I was panicked. It knew the terrain better than I did. Even though I'd walked these trails 1,000 times, it was going to wait until I made a mistake. And in the dark, on this mountain, in my current state, a mistake was inevitable. I started moving again, slower this time, trying to be quiet, trying to preserve what was left of my energy. Behind me, I could hear it moving parallel, keeping pace, not rushing, not attacking, just following. The hunt had begun in earnest now. I would learn, over the next 6 hours, what real fear was. I would learn what it felt like to be prey, and I would learn that the thing following me through these mountains wasn't hunting because it was hungry. It was hunting because it enjoyed it. The descent toward the main trail should have taken me 40 minutes on foot. It took me nearly 3 hours, and I still wasn't sure I'd made it all the way. The thing stayed with me the entire time. Sometimes I could hear it clearly, the crack of branches, the scrape of something heavy against bark. Sometimes it went quiet, and I'd almost convince myself it was gone, that the darkness and my fear had imagined it. Then I'd hear breathing, low and patient, coming from somewhere off to my left. It never got closer. That was the worst part. A normal predator would have rushed me when I was exhausted, when my guard was down. But this thing seemed content to follow, to wait, to let me run myself to death if that's what it took. It was toying with me. Around midnight, I stumbled onto the main chimney tops trail. I recognized the rocky terrain, the distinctive shape of the rock formation I could just barely make out against the marginally lighter sky. The trail here runs relatively open, less dense canopy. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could use that. I could move faster here. I could navigate better. I was wrong. The thing attacked just after I'd been on the main trail for maybe 5 minutes. I didn't see it coming. I heard it, a rush of movement, a sound like something massive shifting its weight at high speed. I spun around, getting my hand up to the bear spray on my belt. That's probably the only thing that saved my life. It came out of the darkness with its mouth open, not a bear. I got that much clear in the instant I saw it before I fired the bear spray directly into its face. The thing shrieked. That was the sound that broke my mind a little. Not a roar, a shriek. High-pitched, almost human, but with harmonics underneath that made my eardrums physically vibrate. It was a sound that something that size shouldn't be able to make. A sound that combined pain and rage and something else, something hungry. The spray hit at full force. I didn't wait to see what would happen. I ran. The trail was better lit this way, and I could see slightly better where I was going. I ran hard, pulling everything I had left from muscles that were already burned out. I could hear the thing behind me moving even faster now. Enraged. The bear spray hadn't stopped it, just made it angrier. I was going to die out here. The realization came as almost a relief. Once you accept that you're going to die, the fear takes on a different quality. Then my boot came down on loose rock. I went down hard, my ankle screaming as it twisted underneath me. I felt the tear in the ligaments, that distinctive pop that meant something had ruptured. I crashed onto the trail, the impact driving the wind from my lungs. The thing was right there. I rolled onto my back, my hand still clutching the bear spray. I was out of air to scream, out of breath, out of options. I could see it now. In the faint light filtering down from the cloud-covered sky, I could make out the shape. It was humanoid. That was the horror of it. It had the basic structure of a human. 2 legs, 2 arms, a head on a neck, but it was wrong in every detail. The limbs were too long, the joints bent at angles that should have broken bone. The head was too large, too heavy for the frame. And the face. I've never talked about the face. Even now, writing this down, I'm not sure I can describe it accurately. It looked like something that had spent a long time studying how humans looked and had decided it understood but had gotten all the proportions slightly off. The eyes were too far apart. The mouth was too wide. The skin, it was pale, almost luminescent in the dark, but covered with patches of hair that looked like it had been burned off in places. And it was wearing clothes. That's what hit me hardest. It was dressed in a ranger uniform. My uniform. The same tan and green outfit I was wearing, torn and blood-stained, hanging off its too thin frame. It was a costume, a mockery. It reached for me with hands that had too many joints in each finger. I sprayed again, desperately. Another burst of bear spray directly into its face. It didn't shriek this time. It just flinched slightly, like it was annoyed. Then it hit me. The impact came from the side, sudden and total. I don't remember it crossing the distance between us. One moment it was in front of me, the next I was on my side with the wind driven completely out of my lungs and something heavy on top of me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I could feel claws. They had to be claws. Nothing else felt like that. Dragging across my ribs where my jacket had torn. I was going to die. This was it. This was the moment I died in the dark on a mountain I'd walked 1,000 times. Then there was light. Sudden, harsh, electric light. A flashlight beam, cutting through the darkness, landing directly on the thing on top of me. The thing shrieked again and rolled off me, shielding its face from the light. I could suddenly breathe, gasping in air like I'd been drowning. There was someone running toward us, flashlight in hand, screaming something I couldn't make out. The thing was moving away from the light, backing toward the forest on the other side of the trail. It was fast, terrifyingly fast. It reached the tree line and stopped for just a moment. In the flashlight beam I could see it more clearly now, and the sight of it in that white light made my brain refuse to process what I was seeing. Then it was gone, into the darkness beyond the trail, moving away. The person with the flashlight reached me. It was another ranger, Dale Hartley, been working the Smokies for almost a decade. He was in his late 50s, tough as rawhide, and probably the most practical man I've ever met. He was also pale as death, staring after where the thing had disappeared. What in the hell was that? His voice was shaking. I couldn't answer. I couldn't form words. I just lay there trying to breathe, trying to process that I was still alive. Dale helped me up. I couldn't put any weight on my left ankle. It was swelling fast. He half carried me, half dragged me down the trail toward the parking area, which was maybe another mile downslope. The whole time he kept his flashlight pointed backward, keeping the beam pointed in the direction the thing had disappeared. How long has it been following you? Dale asked as we moved. Since the summit, I managed to get out. Since maybe 5 p.m., he cursed under his breath. What is it? I asked. I don't know. I don't know what that is. We didn't encounter it again on the way down, but I could feel it. It was back there, in the darkness beyond the flashlight beam, keeping pace, waiting. Dale had come up the trail because the park authorities had gotten concerned. I'd been missing for 8 hours with no radio contact. My last call had reported that I was heading to Clingman's Dome to assess an animal injury. When I didn't check back in after 2 hours, they'd sent Dale up to find me. He'd been climbing the trail for maybe 20 minutes when he heard the shrieking. He'd run toward the sound, flashlight in hand, and found me on the trail with that thing on top of me. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask for details. He got me down the mountain, and we got to the park headquarters just before dawn. By then I was in shock. My ankle was completely immobilized, and I was starting to hallucinate from exhaustion. The next 3 days were a blur of hospital visits, police interviews, and attempts to explain what I couldn't possibly explain. The authorities found no evidence of anything unusual at the Clingman's Dome summit. No animal remains, no signs of a struggle. The boulders where I'd seen the shape and heard the breathing were scoured clean by wind and time, revealing nothing. They found scratches in the rock near where I'd been attacked, but nothing that could definitively be attributed to anything but a bear or large mountain cat. There were no such animals in the Smokies. Everyone knew that. But there were the scratches, and there was my account, given to increasingly skeptical park officials, about being hunted by something humanoid that wore a ranger uniform. The police asked if I was sure about what I saw, in the dark, terrified, with a potentially serious head injury. They asked if I'd been drinking. They asked if there was any chance I'd hallucinated the encounter. They asked if I was sure I hadn't simply encountered a very tall bear or a very aggressive mountain cat. I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd heard. I knew what had felt like claws raking across my ribs. But I also knew how it sounded. I knew how it looked in the cold light of hospital fluorescence, this ranger talking about humanoid monsters in the mountains. So I stopped talking. I gave them the official account. Bear attack, survival instinct. Got lucky when another ranger showed up with a light. They didn't believe it, but they couldn't disprove it either. Dale confirmed my account. He said he'd seen a large animal flee into the forest. He didn't mention the clothes, he didn't mention the hands with too many joints. He just said he saw enough to know it wasn't anything native to North America. The park closed the Clingman's Dome area for 2 weeks while they conducted search operations. They found nothing. I was cleared to go back to limited duty after 6 weeks. My ankle healed in 8 weeks mostly. The physical wounds were nothing. It was the other things that wouldn't heal. I didn't want to go back to the mountains. That was the first honest thing I admitted to myself. The thought of stepping back onto those trails, of being back in the forest where trees blocked out the sky and shadows pooled like water, made my heart rate spike and my palms sweat. But I also couldn't explain why I was quitting. I couldn't tell the Park Service the truth. And I couldn't live with the lie that I was just another ranger who'd had a mental health crisis in the wilderness. So I went back. My first shift was assigned to the lower trails, the heavily traveled routes near the park entrances. The Laurel Falls Trail, which gets hundreds of hikers per day. It was crowded, well lit in the daytime, and far away from Clingman's Dome. It was perfect for someone trying to convince themselves they hadn't changed. It didn't work. Even surrounded by families and tourists and school groups, I could feel the watching sensation, not the focused, hunting attention of the thing on the mountain, just a presence, an awareness. Something was tracking my movements through the park. After 2 weeks of this, I requested transfer to the lower elevation maintenance work. Fence repairs, trail clearing, work that kept me in the park but away from the wild places. My supervisor, a woman named Patricia who'd been with the park almost as long as Dale, pulled me aside and asked me straight if I was okay. Just thought I'd try something different, I told her. She didn't believe me, but she allowed the transfer. I spent the next 6 months doing work that felt like slowly drowning. Fixing fences in daylight, going home in darkness, lying awake at night listening to sounds outside my house. My apartment was just outside the park boundary, in a small town called Cherokee, close enough to the mountains that I could feel them, far enough that the park's lights didn't illuminate the night. Things started happening, small things at first. I'd come home to find my back door open, even though I was certain I'd locked it. There were scratches around the lock, the kind that might be caused by trying to force it open with something that wasn't quite designed for picking locks. like trying to use a human hand that had too many joints. I installed new locks, better locks, motion-sensitive lights, a security system. Nothing deterred it. In February, I came home to find my bedroom window open. The screen had been removed carefully, cut with something sharp. There were muddy footprints on my bedroom floor, large and wrongly proportioned, heading from the window to my bed and back. I'd been asleep. Something had stood in my bedroom, looking down at me while I slept, and I'd never known. That's when I started sleeping somewhere else. Hotels, my parents' house. I drove into Tennessee a few times a month, just to sleep in a different place. Anything to avoid being alone in that house at night. By April, I'd made the decision. I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't keep working for the park, living near the park, existing in the geography where that thing had decided I mattered to it. I started filling out transfer requests, looking for work in other states. The night before my final meeting with Patricia to discuss my resignation, it happened. I was at my parents' house, in the guest room. It was around midnight. I woke up to a sound at the window. Not the window breaking, but something worse. The sound of glass, slowly, carefully being scratched. Like something was trying to remove the pane without breaking it, just like the screen removal at my apartment. I lay in the dark, my heart doing that sick hammering thing it did now, listening to the scratching sound continue. Then a smell came through the partially opened window. The smell I remembered from the mountain. Rot and blood and something ancient. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My hand crept toward the phone on the nightstand. I was going to call 911. I was going to get my parents. The scratching stopped. For a full 5 minutes there was nothing. Just the night sounds of a spring evening. Then I heard something that made everything worse. It was my voice. "Come out, Dakota." My voice coming from outside the window. Exact same inflection, same accent, same everything. But wrong. Like someone had learned how to speak English by studying my voice and decided they understood it well enough to improvise. "Come out. I want to know why." My door was open. My mother had left it that way, but I could still see out the window partially. There was something standing on the lawn outside, visible as an outline against the slightly lighter sky. It was tall, too tall. But the way it was standing, the way its head was angled. "Why did you run?" it asked, still using my voice. "Why did you bring the other one? That wasn't the game." I understood then. It wasn't hungry. It wasn't trying to kill me. It was frustrated. It was angry that I'd gotten away. Angry that Dale had ruined whatever it had planned for that night on the trail. "What do you want?" I called back, my voice sounding small and broken. "I want to understand," the thing said in my voice. "I want to understand how you move, how you think, how you survive in this place. Let me have you. Let me wear you for a while and I'll understand. I'll know what you know. I'll see what you see." I didn't answer. I couldn't answer. The horror of what it was suggesting, wearing me like a suit, like a costume, was so complete that my mind couldn't process it. "If you won't give me this," it said, and now the tone was changing, becoming something not quite my voice anymore, something with layers underneath. "I'll take someone else. Your mother, she's sleeping in the next room. I could take her. I could stand over her bed and..." I got out of bed and ran downstairs. My parents were awake, my mother in her robe, my father on the phone with the sheriff's office. The thing was gone from the window. The police came. They found nothing. No scratches on the glass. No evidence anything had been there. My mother was shaken but unharmed. My father looked at me like I was breaking apart in front of him, and he was trying to figure out how to help someone who was becoming unraveled. I left the next morning. I drove to the park headquarters. I turned in my badge. I gave my resignation, and I didn't look back. It's been 4 years now. I'm not a park ranger anymore. I work in data entry, in a cubicle, in an office building in Knoxville, as far from mountains as I could get while still staying in Tennessee. The job is mind-numbing and slow, and I'm grateful for that. Grateful for the repetitive tasks. Grateful for the fluorescent lights and the absence of shadows. I still live in Tennessee, but I've moved apartment 4 times. I've changed my phone number. I don't go back to the mountains, not even for camping, not even for the kind of wilderness hiking that used to center my life. Every time I think about driving up to those elevations, I get the same sensation of watching. The same knowledge that something is aware of my location. I've never told anyone the complete truth. Not my family, not my therapist. Yes, I see one. Long-term trauma and ongoing psychological distress were the official diagnoses, not the internet strangers who found out about my incident with the Park Service. I've let them believe it was a bear attack, a misidentification, the kind of thing that happens in wild places. I've never tried to convince anyone of what I know. Because here's what I understand now. After 4 years of living with this knowledge, that thing was right about one thing. It understood something about the mountains that I didn't. I've been researching, not officially, not openly, but late at night in articles and folklore collections and university digital archives. The Smoky Mountains were Cherokee territory for centuries. Before that, other tribes used them for hunting grounds. And in every tradition, in every story I could find, there were accounts of things that walked like men but weren't quite men. Things that imitated, things that wore. The story is old. The mountains remember stories. I don't know what the thing that hunted me was. I don't know if it was an individual creature or just one expression of something older that's been in those mountains longer than humans have had words for it. I don't know if it was hunting me specifically or if I was just the first human in a long time who'd caught its attention. What I do know is that it was real. That what I experienced wasn't a hallucination or a bear attack or a misidentification. Something touched me on that mountain. And even though its claws only caught ribs, even though it never truly hurt me, even though Dale got me away before it could finish whatever it wanted to do, it changed me. Every shadow bothers me now. Every person who stands too close. Every moment of being alone triggers the primal certainty that something is watching. I can't go back to the places I loved. I can't be the person I was. There's a weight to survival sometimes. A cost that nobody talks about. Dale quit the park a year after my incident. I ran into him once, 2 years ago, at a grocery store. He looked older than he should have. We didn't talk about what happened. We just exchanged a look, one that said we both understood that there were things in the world that didn't make sense. Things that operated by rules we couldn't understand, and that sometimes if you were lucky you survived an encounter with them, and then you spent the rest of your life wondering if the thing had let you survive. Sometimes I drive past the park boundary just to feel close to those mountains again, but I don't go in. I don't hike the trails. I don't put myself in a position where I might have to face the thing again, or worse, where I might discover that it's followed me to wherever I've gone, because I'm not entirely sure I've lost it. Sometimes late at night I hear something in the hallway outside my apartment, a scraping sound, like something trying to get under the door. I lie in bed, lights off, not calling the police. They've stopped coming, stopped believing, just listening, and I wait to hear my own voice call my name. That's the last thing it promised me, on my parents' lawn, that someday, maybe not soon, maybe not for years, I'd hear my own voice calling from outside my window, and that when I did, I would understand that it had finally gotten inside, that it had finally been patient enough, smart enough, good enough at imitating to perfectly copy the one thing I couldn't refuse, my own face, my own voice, my own hands, and it would stand at my window and ask me to come out, and I wouldn't be able to refuse because in some fundamental way I would be refusing myself. This is the weight I carry now, not the memory of being hunted on a mountain. Not the trauma of those hours in the dark, just the endless, patient waiting and the certainty that someday when I open my door, there will be a ranger in a torn uniform standing in my hallway, and it will be me, and it will finally have what it came for.